Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. The Israeli cabinet will meet on Friday to approve the brokered ceasefire agreement. Both US President Joe Biden and incoming President Donald Trump claim credit for the ceasefire talks. And the UK promises Ukraine a 100-year partnership to support the country's defence, energy and trade as a Russian drone is shot down from the sky. To our top story, and the Israeli cabinet will meet on Friday to approve the brokered ceasefire. That's according to Israeli media. A government spokesman had previously said the deal had not been finalized yet, and the team was continuing efforts to reach a solution. Meanwhile, hundreds of protesters have gathered in Jerusalem to demonstrate against the ceasefire. They believe the deal is bad for Israel and the country has surrendered to Hamas. Hamas say at least 73 Palestinians were killed in Israeli strikes since the ceasefire was announced. Let's go live to Tel Aviv now to speak to our reporter, Blake Shifton. Blake, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Last night, it looked like the ceasefire was all going ahead. We're now being told the cabinet meeting will take place tomorrow. What more do we know at this stage?
Yes, that's right. We've had details emerging in the last few moments in Israeli media that the final hurdles, the final issues on a deal have been ironed out and that the cabinet will meet on Friday, as you say. Earlier on Thursday, the Israeli Prime Minister's office had accused Hamas of reneging on certain parts of the deal, on pushing for more concessions, and specifically this related to the list of the names of Palestinian prisoners who will be exchanged for hostages in the deal that is expected to take place on Sunday. But as you've said, it seems that the Israeli government, their concerns have been assuaged. Hamas had said that they were fully committed to the deal, and now it does appear as if the deal will proceed as normal. At least the cabinet meeting will proceed as normal on Friday.
Blake, there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the deal. Does Benjamin Netanyahu actually have the support to get this deal approved tomorrow?
When the cabinet meeting, the security cabinet and wider cabinet meetings are held tomorrow, it is expected that Benjamin Netanyahu will have the votes, will have the support to get the deal approved. That's despite some pretty aggressive and steadfast opposition to the deal from the far right, including Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. They are opposed to this deal, as they've been opposed to any prospect of a ceasefire deal since essentially the war began. However, even if they were to leave the government in protest of this deal, centrist leader Yair Lapid has said that he would step in and he would give his party's votes to prop up the governing coalition in order for a deal to go through.
73 people have been reportedly killed in Israeli strikes on Gaza since a deal was agreed. Is this Israel's last-ditch attempt to destroy Hamas?
Traditionally, ahead of ceasefires, we have seen an uptick in violence and attacks by the Israeli military. We saw that ahead of the ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon. This, of course, is of no solace to the people of Gaza, who have suffered immeasurably under this war. The last 15 months, more than 46,000 people have been killed in Gaza, according to local health authorities. Hamas, for their part, have warned that continuing Israeli attacks in the days leading up to this deal do risk potentially harming or killing the hostages mere days before the first number of them are expected to be released.
Blake Shifton in Tel Aviv, thank you so much for joining me this evening. To Washington now, and US President-elect Donald Trump says his victory in the election is why Israel and Hamas have agreed on a ceasefire and a hostage deal. However, President Joe Biden is still in the White House for a few more days and credits the hard work of his administration. Caroline Malone reports.
After 8 months of nonstop negotiation, my administration, a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached by Israel and Hamas.
US President Joe Biden making this major announcement just before he exits the White House.
This plan was developed and negotiated by my team and will be largely implemented by the incoming administration. That's why I told my team to keep the incoming administration fully informed, because that's how it should be.
President-elect Donald Trump has also claimed credit in a Truth Social post, saying this epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory in November, as it signalled to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans and our allies. I am thrilled American and Israeli hostages will be returning home to be reunited with their families and loved ones. Analysis from Washington suggests both Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump's teams played a part.
It took President Trump's election to finally shake things up between the pressure he was putting on all parties involved, President Biden's desire to stop this before he left office, and the fact that I think the Israeli government had caused all the damage they could. I think all those factors together finally got us to the point where a ceasefire deal was struck.
It's most significant, though, for the people directly involved, relatives of the hostages who have some relief after waiting for months for news of their loved ones to now hear the first phase of the deal will include the release of 33 people. And for the 2.3 million residents of Gaza, who have endured Israel killing more than 46,000 people in retaliation for Hamas taking hostages and killing 1,200 people on October 7th, 15 long months ago. This major deal coming just days before President Biden exits the White House and may be part of his legacy. But it may also provide a platform for President-elect Trump to build on the Abraham Accords, the normalization of relations between Israel and other countries in the region. The real question now, though, is once the ceasefire starts on Sunday, will it halt? Caroline Malone, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
I'm now joined by Daniel Levy, a former peace negotiator for Israeli governments and president of the US Middle East Project. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, Daniel. Daniel, let's start off with Joe Biden and Donald Trump. They're both taking credit for ceasefire talks. Does one administration have more sway over the other?
I don't think there's any doubt as to what's going on. People who want to be generous and polite can say, isn't this fabulous? Both an outgoing and an incoming administration can share whatever credit there is. That's not what's happened. Prime Minister Netanyahu realized quite some time ago that the Biden administration could be led by the nose. They refused to use their leverage with the Israeli side. They gave Israel all the arms, the money, the diplomatic, political, legal, economic backing. They even sang from the Israeli message sheet. And Israel knew that it could play those people. Now, I'm not suggesting that Trump came in and read the riot or had to promise things. But Netanyahu looked at Trump and said, which I think has happened in a number of places, this trepidation factor. He looked and said, this is a man who may act like the leader of a superpower. He's not going to do things to free the Palestinians, secure their rights, end the occupation. But he might do things that cut across my domestic political needs. And I'm not sure I know how to play him. And therefore, the only factor that mattered, Biden tells us these things take a long time. This would never happen if Blinken, liar-in-chief of this outgoing administration, and that team was still in office. But Prime Minister Netanyahu looked at this, and this is precisely the moment he never wanted to arrive at, to have to make this decision between his domestic political calculation and this uncertainty as to where the American president might go. And you can see that's exactly how it's played out today. Leigh Ann, Netanyahu doesn't want to go ahead with this because he knows that it causes him a very significant political headache at home with his coalition.
Yes, absolutely, Daniel. And Daniel, we're hearing the Israeli cabinet are to meet tomorrow to approve this brokered ceasefire agreement. Do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu has enough support to get this through? As you said, at home, he is facing factions.
So, Leigh Ann, he has a majority inside his government. He has a majority inside his security cabinet, and he has a majority in the parliament. What he may not have is a coalition that exists today that could exist in the same contours tomorrow. I'm using tomorrow loosely, if he goes ahead and implements this deal. Two of the factions, the most extreme factions in what is in its entirety an extreme government, the two most extreme factions are threatening to oppose, are threatening to leave the government. They may well do so. Will they vote against the government? Will they bring it down? For the deal itself, he will have a safety net from the opposition. But going forward, his government might be in jeopardy, which is why I think what he's trying to achieve between today and tomorrow is nothing to do with the last-minute demands Hamas have made. Most of the retractions, most of the climb downs have come from Netanyahu because he was the one blocking a deal, not the lie we've been told by the Americans and others that it was Hamas that was the obstacle. They negotiated a hard bargain, but they stuck to their positions. Israel kept shifting its position. But what Netanyahu will hope that is in the coming day, he can do things to smooth some of these rougher edges inside his coalition. And then I think what we can expect is that Netanyahu, throughout this, will try to get out of the deal, torpedo the deal, prevent the deal from going forward while trying to place the blame on the other side. He probably looks at this and says, you know, the Western leadership, the American leadership, eventually I'll be able to bring them on board. And he may well be correct, but he doesn't want to be in this place. And here he finds himself.
That moves me on to my next question, actually. Once an agreement is met, there are several stages of this deal that we have to consider. But Netanyahu has promised the hardliners in his cabinet that he will continue the war after the first phase does end. You've just hinted to it, but do you think this will be the case? Do you think we'll see the fighting, you know, reignited after the first phase of the ceasefire deal?
There's a pretty strong consensus in both the pro and anti-Netanyahu camps, if you like, inside Israel, that will be his intention to continue this is very plausibly a genocide that Israel is conducting in Gaza. To continue those military operations, I would say, at the earliest opportunity, because the deal itself means, if it's implemented, that Israel would have to release a significant number of those Palestinians being held, thousands of them in Israeli prisons, often detention without trial, in order to get all the Israelis home. And Israel would have to withdraw militarily from Gaza. That would further entrench what is already beginning to emerge as an understanding that for all the death and destruction, this is not a war that Israel can claim to have won, partly because if you don't have a political plan for the day after, and Israel has no political plan other than killing more Palestinians, displacing more Palestinians, if you don't have a political plan, it's very hard to secure these things militarily. Hamas is still standing, and that's kind of the real problem in that bigger narrative for Netanyahu. But this matters. The fear that Netanyahu has had throughout, and he has today, is that once a deal starts getting implemented, things can take on a dynamic of their own. Once Israelis see that hostages come home alive, the pressure to continue with that, not to allow those who are still presumed to be alive but who wouldn't be part of the first phase, not to allow them to stay behind. Other dynamics, he doesn't want the world to see the destruction in Gaza. Most media outlets haven't been showing real scenes from inside Gaza. He doesn't want the humanitarian assistance to be ramped up. So this will take on a dynamic of its own, and he's worried that it won't be as easy to return to the fighting and the killing as he would like it to be. And that's something we'll see play out. I think he'll try. He may well succeed. He'll probably have Trump's support for that. But right now, we're in this might not be so easy. And therefore, hopefully we don't go there as far as he is concerned.
Former peace negotiator Daniel Levy, thank you so much for your insights this evening.
Thank you, Leah.
As well as a return of hostages and a withdrawal of Israeli troops, a ceasefire deal should involve a surge in humanitarian aid into Gaza. The United Nations have revealed that at least 1.9 million people have been displaced over the last 15 months of war, with 92% of housing units destroyed. 68% of road networks have been damaged, and 88% of school buildings requiring rebuilding or major repairs. For more on this, I'm now joined from Amman by Jonathan Fowler, a spokesperson for the UNRWA. Jonathan, a pleasure to speak to you this evening. The humanitarian situation is at catastrophic levels as aid trucks are waiting to enter Gaza. How is this uncertainty over the ceasefire impacting getting those critical supplies to people who need it the most?
Well, frankly, I mean, the ceasefire is an essential step when it's actually implemented to being able to scale up aid. But from the very beginning of this war, it has been impossible to get the scale of aid required in. So the needs, as you might imagine, if you can't get enough aid in, then the needs on the ground have been spiraling. This is an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. So all we actually need now is we need rapid, unhindered, safe and uninterrupted humanitarian access in order to deliver the vital supplies into Gaza and to respond to the tremendous suffering caused by this war. So we really hope that the deal will translate into an increased flow of a combination of humanitarian aid and commercial supplies, because the markets have to get going as well.
Since October the 7th, there is tremendous suffering caused by the conflict. What have been the major obstacles in the way for you and your teams operating and trying to get those necessary supplies into Gaza?
Well, there's multiple factors. And to begin with, getting aid across the border has been severely restricted. So there have been heavy inspections by the Israeli authorities. Trucks, for example, haven't been able to arrive fully loaded. They've had to arrive half loaded because that's easier to inspect. There have been items that we've not been able to get in, humanitarians generally, including UNRWA. There have been restrictions, for example, on tarpaulins to be able to erect tents during the winter weather, these kind of things. So replacing the supplies which are worn out and getting the necessary supplies in, certain kinds of medicine have also been banned. But that's just one part of the story. So getting aid to the border, then the aid needs to be offloaded onto trucks to distribute it within the Gaza Strip. And there, the utter breakdown of law and order and security within the Gaza Strip has rendered it extremely dangerous and very, very problematic for humanitarians to be able to do their job. We've had looting through desperation. We've had a rise in criminal gangs. We've had an utter failure of what we call deconfliction, which is what we do in any war zone as humanitarians. That's that we need to speak with the warring parties in order to ensure that we're able to move around in as much safety as possible. And we've had denials of convoys from the Israeli military, for example, being able to move around, these kind of things. Plus, and this is a significant factor, you cited the number of displaced people in your introduction to this report. The fact that people are displaced means that they're not necessarily tomorrow going to be where you are expecting to be able to deliver aid to them, because they received forced displacement orders to move around. So we do have to hope that a ceasefire will at least enable a cessation of that forced displacement, and that will enable us to get aid to people as necessary.
And let's just touch on that displacement. So nearly 2 million people, as we've just been talking about, have been displaced. If a ceasefire agreement is agreed, are these people actually able to return to any form of safety in Gaza anytime soon? We've seen the destruction of the houses, of the hospitals, of the schools, of critical infrastructure. I mean, what does the future hold?
Well, a fundamental desire, of course, that anybody has in such a situation is to go home. But as you quite rightly flag, the utter destruction means that people don't necessarily have homes to go to. But people will want to go back to their communities of origin to at least see what the situation is, whether their house is still half standing, standing completely, or indeed completely destroyed and a mound of rubble. But of course, the perils of moving around in an environment where there's so much destruction, the roads are littered with debris, there's unexploded ordnance all over the place. Tragically, there are huge numbers of people, dead bodies under the rubble. The lack of access, for example, to safe water, drinking water, food supplies, all these kind of things means that if people do want to try to go back to where they are, the supplies and what they need may not be easy to get to them and may not be there. So there are going to be population movements. It's also not clear, and at this stage, of course, we don't know exactly the terms of the deal, but it's not clear whether people will be able to go back to all areas of the Gaza Strip. And then the question is, who remains where and who is displaced? How do we deal with that kind of situation? So, I mean, all of this means that, yes, I mean, the guns need to fall silent in any war in order for humanitarians to be able to do their job more effectively. But that's just the beginning. It's just a stepping stone to being able to alleviate massive humanitarian disasters like this.
Jonathan Fowler, spokesperson for UNRWA, thank you so much for joining us and bringing us the news on the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. Qatar has called on Israel to withdraw from the Golan Heights buffer zone during a joint conference with the new Syrian leader. It comes during the Qatari Prime Minister's visit to Damascus. Israel has seized much of the area after the fall of the Assad regime. Syria's Ahmed al-Sharaa says he is counting on Doha's support to stop Israel from making further advances. The US has imposed hundreds of sanctions targeting Russia in the final days of the Biden administration. The new curbs target 100 critical Russian entities, including banks and companies in the energy sector. It also takes aim at the country's evasion of US sanctions and its military-industrial base. A reversal of these new sanctions does require Congress to be notified. The winds in California are finally dying down, helping firefighters to control the blaze. Over 12,000 structures have been destroyed, and residents and business owners look at a months-long timeline for rebuilding. The death toll remains at 25, and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass warns that they are not out of the woods yet. Bollywood actor Saif Ali is recovering after he was stabbed by an intruder in his home. The knife attack is believed to have taken place during a burglary attempted in Mumbai. Local authorities are investigating the incident. Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin has successfully launched its first rocket powerful enough to send satellites into space. The New Glenn's debut flight took off from Cape Canaveral in Florida. The Blue Ring Pathfinder technology on board was successfully carried into orbit, but the reusable booster did not make its way back to the landing station. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has signed a 100-year partnership treaty between the UK and Ukraine during his visit to Kyiv today. The UK says the 100-year pledge includes support in defence, energy and trade. Starmer also promised a further £40 billion to support Ukraine's recovery post-war and sat down with President Zelensky to discuss a joint ceasefire plan with France. Here's what Starmer had to say say about the intention of the trip.
One of the consequences of this conflict has been to draw NATO more strongly together. It's bigger and stronger than it has been, and we must stand behind Ukraine for as long as it takes. But when we say Ukraine must be in the strongest possible position, that can't be just words. And that's why I've had such intense discussions with President Zelensky now over the months that I've been Prime Minister, and will again here in Ukraine.
Let's go live to London now to speak to our correspondent, Oli Barrett. Oli, quite a promise from the Prime Minister there and a genuine guarantee for Ukraine. How has his trip gone down in London while the country battles real uncertain times in the economy?
Well, I think part of the uncertainty around the economy means that perhaps Keir Starmer got rather less attention from British media than he might have done on a trip to Kyiv in different times when there wasn't so much going on domestically in the news agenda here, but also with regards to the ceasefire or lack thereof until this point in Gaza. But at the same time, the support for Ukraine that Britain has been pledging and sending over the last couple of years has pretty broad-based political support here in the UK. So this isn't the kind of pledge that is going to be criticised by opposition parties here in the UK. It has that broad support, and that remains. The interesting thing about this 100-year partnership is what the UK is trying to do is really signal that its support and cooperation will be there with the Ukrainians, not just through the course of the conflict that is still playing out, but beyond any type of ceasefire that might be able to be reached in some kind of peace deal at some point in the future. So the UK trying to signal that it does want to cooperate with regards to the economy, technology and health, not just in the area of defence going forward.
I just actually want to correct myself quickly, Ollie. I said Starmer also promised a further £40 million to support Ukraine's recovery post-war. That's £40 million. Let's just move on. Donald Trump takes over the White House next week. We know he has plans to speak to President Putin. Could Starmer's pledge to Ukraine cause any kind of diplomatic difficulty between the UK and the new incoming US administration?
Well, I don't think it will be any surprise to the incoming Trump administration. They know the British position here. They know that this type of pledge is the type of thing Britain has been rolling out over the last couple of years and is likely to continue to do so. There is the potential, though, for difficulties down the line in the bilateral relationship if Donald Trump were to deviate significantly from the previous US position of support for Ukraine. Now, I think there is cautious optimism here in London that actually Donald Trump and his incoming administration aren't going to just immediately withdraw support for the Ukrainians and perhaps move over closer to a Russian position with regards to trying to find an out in this conflict around some kind of peace deal or ceasefire. There's been a lot of diplomacy going on between the UK and incoming figures in the Trump administration to try and make the case that actually Ukraine does need ongoing support and will need to be supported up to, during and beyond any type of peace negotiations with Russia, and needs to be put in the strongest position possible for those talks. But if Donald Trump and Keir Starmer were to start to move apart in their positions when it comes to exactly what to do about Ukraine and Russia and any potential further peace talks, there is the potential there for diplomatic difficulties between Washington and London further down the line.
Yes, we'll have to wait and see further down the line. Oli Barrett in London, thank you so much for joining me. Let's take a look at the top business news. BP is cutting over 5% of its global workforce as part of the CEO's plan to reduce costs and rebuild investor confidence in the energy giant. Around 4,700 employees and 3,000 contractor positions will be cut this year, according to an internal memo which was released today. The CEO, Murray Auchincloss, is aiming to cut at least $2 billion in costs by 2026. Lufthansa is set to resume flights to and from Tel Aviv in Israel at the beginning of next month. The German airline made the announcement as Wizz Air restarted its London to Tel Aviv route today, following a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. Many Western carriers cancelled flights to swathes of the Middle East in recent months, including Beirut and Tel Aviv, as conflict tore across the region. Let's go to sport now, and it was another packed day of action at the Australian Open. Emma Raducanu started off with a victory over Amanda Anisimov. She sets up a third-round tie against world number 2 Iga Swiatek. But it was a bad news for British number 1 Katie Boulter, who was beaten in a roller coaster match. Defending champion Jannik Sinner is through to the third round, along with American Taylor Fritz. Liverpool forward Mo Salah could be making a move to the Saudi Pro League, with reports of a £65 million deal across 2 seasons. Salah's contract with the Merseyside club expires in the summer, and the Egyptian is yet to sign an extension. The 32-year-old has won 8 trophies at Anfield during his time at the club. Now, he's the former British Chancellor who also oversaw the UK's COVID-19 vaccination programme. And today, Nadim Zahawi has been announced as the chair of the advisory board of Adore Diagnostics, an Israeli medical group which aims at detecting and managing infectious diseases. And he joins me now from London. Welcome, Nadim Zahawi. First of all, tell us about this new role and what Adore Diagnostics is aiming to achieve, especially with you on the board now.
Thank you for having me on. Yes, I'm very excited about Adore. During the pandemic, and of course, you remember I was the vaccine deployment minister for the United Kingdom, we all heard about PCR testing. I think the whole world had to be tested and retested over and over again. What Adore have developed is a much more powerful, in my view, testing platforms called rolling circle amplification. So RCA, you will begin to hear much more about than PCR. It's patented by Adore. It's backed by Mike Milken's family office and Howard Shaw of Shaw Capital in the UK. And the exciting thing about it is, at the moment, if you go to a doctor with a chest infection, they rarely know forensically which pathogen happens to be in your lungs. Adore will be able to give forensic detail of over 100 different pathogens in 30 to 45 minutes. So near patient diagnosis becomes incredibly powerful. Full automation, so it doesn't need an expert to actually conduct the test. And of course, geomapping in future outbreaks makes it very powerful technology. And I'm excited about the future. We've got preclinical validation in the Rome Lazarus Spallanzani Institute, one of the most important institutes there. That's after successful preclinical validation that took place in Israel, in Tel Aviv. So it's an exciting business. I think in diagnostics world, this is probably one of the most interesting businesses that I've certainly had the privilege to get to know well and to chair the advisory board. So I'm very excited about the role.
Mr. Zahawi, I must say I remember PCR tests extremely well. Now, you've just spoken about Adore. It's a technology-based health company. How are you planning on making this attractive to the public? And will it be regularly used in global healthcare systems like the NHS? Because like you said, it can trace the pathogens and it can know what possible infection you have. So it could cut down a lot of waiting times. We've seen a lot of backlog in the NHS.
I think it certainly can do that. It can, we think, we're confident we can detect everything from over 100 different pathogens to stomach ulcers to sepsis. So you'll have a number of benefits. Obviously, one is cutting down infections, which is probably the ultimate benefit, but also the right use of antibiotics, because at the moment, if a doctor doesn't know which pathogen you have in your lungs, they normally just prescribe an antibiotic and sort of, cross their fingers and hope for the best. Whereas with Ador's diagnostic technology, we'll be much more forensic about the diagnosis and which pathogen exactly that it needs to be treated. And so really exciting for different healthcare systems, not just in the United Kingdom, but I think also in the Middle East, whether it's in, I'm hoping to talk to some of my colleagues in Saudi and the UAE and other places. But once we've got the preclinical validation, which we're confident in because we've had it from Israel, from Italy, from Rome.
Ador is an Israeli medical group. Your chairman is a former first lieutenant in the Israel Navy. What's your reaction to the ceasefire? And will Israel now have the chance to show her best self, as I know you once said in Parliament?
I did. And I absolutely am confident that Israel will now have an opportunity to show the best of herself. I hope that we can build on this ceasefire, that the families who've been waiting so anxiously for their loved ones to be returned home, and for those who sadly lost loved ones to have finality and closure, and of course for the Palestinian people who have been suffering under the hands of the terrorist Hamas, will have a sort of a new dawn. The day after plan, I think, is probably the most important thing to focus on now. And I have to say, as part of that, I think there needs to be a government of technocrats rather than, dare I say, if he can be persuaded, which I think he can be, Abu Mazen actually handing the baton over to a group that can deliver for the beleaguered Palestinian people.
And I just want to ask you a quick question. I remember you being a Chancellor, of course, and what advice would you give to Rachel Reeves right now? She's going through a pretty torrid time. And I think, what's your take on the current UK economy? And honestly, what do you think Rachel Reeves should do?
I think it's self-inflicted, I'm afraid. I think it's heartbreaking. I say this more in sorrow than in anger, that I told you so. You don't get growth by increasing the burden of taxation on the workforce, which is what Rachel has done. You don't get growth without understanding what business investment needs in the United Kingdom. You don't get growth by attacking our farmers with the farm tax or an inheritance tax. What I wanted to do as part of my growth round was abolish inheritance tax altogether. You'll see many more family trusts from around the world would look at the UK as an investment destination. And I think it's absolutely doable. It's an unfair tax. It's double taxation in many ways. And I would also have introduced an enterprise residency where you look at what Prime Minister Meloni's done in Italy, where you can now live in Italy, pay 200,000 euros per adult. We are, I think, more attractive than Italy in the United Kingdom. And that would have more than compensated for the loss of taxation from the inheritance tax. I'd do something for small business and on business rates for the small retailers on the high street who are really suffering in the UK. But unfortunately, this government chose to give train drivers a massive uplift in wages, pretty much gave in to most of the unions very early on in their term. And the result is where we've ended up today, where there's very much a hiatus in the markets when it comes to UK government gilts. Why? Because people don't feel that the Chancellor is competent enough. And it really is a very, very sad state of affairs.
Nadim Zahawi, thank you so much. Much you say there, the UK did return to growth today for the first time in 3 months. But I hope Rachel Reeves is listening to your advice.
Anemic growth.
And a reminder of our top stories. The Israeli cabinet will meet on Friday to approve the brokered ceasefire agreement. Both US President Joe Biden and incoming President Donald Trump claim credit for the ceasefire talks. And the UK promises Ukraine a 100-year partnership to support the country's defence, energy and trade as a Russian drone is shot down from the sky. Thank you from us on W News. Thank you for joining us. Coming up next, we have special interviews with the former Lebanese Prime Minister, with the former Lebanese MP Sami Fatfat and Israel's Energy Minister Eli Cohen. And don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
At our Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Mr. Eli Cohen, Minister of Energy in Israel, can you tell us what happened in Doha, in the talks of the hostages, the Israeli hostages in Gaza? Is there any development in these talks in Doha?
There is progress in the negotiations, but there are details that have not yet been agreed upon. Hamas understands that Israel is determined to recover all 100 hostages. The negotiations are being conducted under fire. Hamas is receiving blows and understands that there is no one to save it. Not Hezbollah, not Nasrallah, who is in hell, not Iran, nor anyone else. Additionally, in exactly 2 weeks, President Trump is expected to take office, which will mean increased international support for Israel. I am sending a message to Hamas. Anyone who harms the hostages will be held accountable. All the heroes of Hamas who posted pictures on October 7th while assaulting Israeli citizens will be held accountable one by one. We have everything documented. The same applies to anyone who harms the hostages. They will be held accountable.
Now, can we say that there is we are close to a solution to this issue of the hostages?
There is a narrowing of gaps. Ultimately, in my estimation, the matter depends on Mohammed Sinwar. The Sinwar family has brought disaster to Gaza, where there are evacuees and displaced people who have witnessed the strength of the Israeli army. The state of Israel can be surprised, but it cannot be defeated.
Can you tell us when this war will end in Gaza?
When 2 main conditions are achieved, when the hostages are returned, and when Hamas leaders lay down their weapons and leave the Gaza Strip.
You will accept that the Hamas leaders will leave Gaza and not to kill them?
Anyone who killed Israelis will be held accountable. If they want Gaza to take a new direction, they must understand 2 things. The hostages must be returned, and Hamas must not control Gaza the day after.
But we see that Hamas can launch missiles, rockets to Israel till now. After 1 year and 2-3 months, they are still attacked Israel. How this war can be, how can you win in this war?
The outcome of the war is clear. The state of Israel is superior. All the senior Hamas leaders have been assassinated. The division commanders, Al-Daif and Sinwar, have been eliminated. Hamas infrastructure, including its terrorist infrastructure, has been destroyed. They have seen Israel's strength and know that Israel can enter anywhere in Gaza and any time. They can no longer fire hundreds or thousands of rockets toward Israel. The October 7th attack was suicide for Hamas.
But we see that they are also kill soldiers in Gaza. Every 3 days, they kill 1 or 2 or 3 soldiers. Are you accept that? You will stay there and accept that your soldiers will be killed by the Hamas people?
We have brave and heroic soldiers and commanders. While our leaders and soldiers are on the front lines, Hamas leaders are hiding like rats. Mohammed Sinwar and others are too afraid to show their faces. We are there. For us, women and children are in the rear while we fight. For them, they use women and children as shields for terrorists and attackers.
How much time you will stay in Gaza after after the hostages issue will be solved? Did Israel plan to stay in Gaza more time than you are there?
The State of Israel can act in Gaza against any attempt to revive terrorism and against any attempt to produce weapons.
Even if it's after the day after?
We will not allow a reorganization of terrorism. Ultimately, the Muslim Brotherhood axis threatens not only Israel, but also other countries in the region. We have brought the Shia axis, led by Iran, to its weakest point since 1979. Hamas has been harmed, Hezbollah has been harmed, and Nasrallah is no longer with us. As a result of Israel's actions, the Assad regime has collapsed. We are working against Iran. The Shia axis is hence at its lowest point. We are proving one thing: whoever raises their hand against Israel will have it cut off.
Will you accept the Palestinian Authority walking in Gaza the day after?
The Palestinian Authority continues to encourage incitement in its educational curricula. If you read the textbooks of the Authority, you will see that they glorify murderers. This is not a way to reach agreements with us. Even President Biden has said that the Authority needs serious reforms, and this issue will become even more prominent during Trump's term.
If they will make changes in the Palestinian Authority, are they will go and work in Gaza the day after? You accept that as Israel?
I believe we will first need to see a transitional period, with the presence of international forces such as the United States, Europe, and moderate Muslim countries. We want to live in peace and happiness with our neighbors in Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf countries. We also have common interests against extremist Islamist jihadist elements and Iran's agendas. Iran is like cancer. Every country it has intervened in has been harmed. It has destroyed Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, and it is affecting Iraq as well. Other countries want Iran distant from it because, wherever it is present, it works against their interests. In Jordan, the dream now is to rid themselves of Iranian interferences because they have seen what happened in Lebanon, where the economy was destroyed and people's lives were harmed.
You mentioned Iran. Will Israel attack Iran, the nuclear program?
Israel pledges that Iran will not possess nuclear weapons. I believe that an international coalition led by the United States must act against Iran, and if they do not, Israel will. Ultimately, Iran is a country that denies human rights to its people.
You already attacked in Iran. You can repeat that?
We have proven that we can reach any location in the Middle East, even over 2,000 kilometers away from Israel, with accurate intelligence and significant capabilities. Preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons is not only in Israel's interest, but also in the interest of the world and the entire region. I am fully aware of what the Islamic countries surrounding Iran think. I am in contact with my colleagues, the foreign ministers. They are wary of Iran.
You mean Bahrain and UAE?
I won't mention specific names, but all Islamic countries surrounding Iran want Israel to win its war against the Muslim Brotherhood and in its confrontation with Iran. This is what all countries want. Israel is the only country capable of acting and fighting. This is an international and regional interest. Our vision for the future includes the resumption of peace agreements, such as the Abraham Accords with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. We see tourism flourishing between these countries, trade agreements being signed, cooperation increasing, and regional stability strengthening. We think that the relationship is ongoing and continuous. I believe that Trump's era will be a time of clarity in addressing Iran. It will be a time when regional stability could advance and peace agreements could be expanded.
Do you think that Saudi Arabia now want to continue the negotiation and the talks with a normalization with Israel without solution to the Palestinian issue?
First, Saudi Arabia must focus on its citizens. The threat to Saudi Arabia does not come from Israel. Israel could be a partner to Saudi Arabia. The threat facing Saudi Arabia comes from Iran. Therefore, an international coalition led by the United States and moderate nations would primarily benefit Saudi Arabia in addressing these threats. We have the potential to achieve peace with the entire Sunni Muslim world, including Saudi Arabia.
Can Israel make peace with Saudi Arabia without any development in the Palestinian issue?
I say, if we consider Saudi Arabia's perspective, its primary interest is stability in the Middle East. Wherever Israel is not present, jihadists and Iran's influence take hold. For example, Israel withdrew from Gaza. And what happened? The Hamas government, a terrorist state, took control. Iranian influence took hold. The residents of Gaza did not get democracy, human rights, or a better standard of living. Their quality of life significantly declined.
Yes, but I ask you about Saudi Arabia, not about Gaza, not about any place. What happened in Syria now when those organizations, the Muslims, jihadist organizations now, control Syria? What do you think as Israel? It's, you know, it's something that make you very, you know, can this influence in Israel?
We are monitoring what is happening in Syria. First of all, we want to defend our towns. We clearly tell all parties there that we will address any attempts to transfer weapons to Lebanon from Iran or Iraq or Syria. There's no doubt that the current rulers of Syria have a very controversial background, as they include former Islamist jihadists and former Al-Qaeda members. It remains to be seen whether they will attempt to go back to their old ways. The world will be evaluating them, and Israel will also do so. I advise them not to test Israel or defy it. We are a country that wants good neighborliness. Anyone who seeks to harm or threaten Israel will end up like Sinwar and Nasrallah.
Will Israel withdraw from the places that you occupied from the Syrian land?
We are present there to ensure the safety of our residents, and we want to see where Syria is heading. When we see that its direction respects the ceasefire agreements of 1974, and when we ensure the security of our northern residents, then and only then we will move forward.
There is talks that Israel support the Kurds and the Druze in Syria. It's true? Are you supporting those people?
First of all, we have good relations with the Druze around the world, and of course in Israel. The Druze in Israel are our brothers and allies, and we have a very good relationship with them in Israel. Israel also has a historically good and a close relationship with the Kurds.
Are you planning to make with them something in Syria, autonomy or something like that, or you are waiting for their decisions.
We believe in preserving all communities and ensuring that no harm comes to the Kurds and Druze. They should not be harmed, and we have a close relationship with these groups. It is essential to protect minorities, and this is an expectation from anyone involved in Syria.
And what about Lebanon? What will be with this ceasefire? Will end in 2 or 3 weeks. And after that, is Israel will stay there, or will Israel will go to the border?
Israel insists on the implementation of the agreement and expects the Lebanese government and other parties involved to respect it. They must ensure that Hezbollah withdraws behind the Litani River and that Hezbollah does not infiltrate the Lebanese army. Israel has fulfilled its mission, and the Lebanese people now have an opportunity to regain their country. So far, Hezbollah has done nothing good for Lebanon. It has only acted in favor of Iran. Hezbollah does not take orders from Beirut. It takes orders directly from Tehran. Lebanon used to be the Paris of the Middle East in the 1980s, and we want it to return to that. We have no quarrel with Lebanon or any problems over these issues. This is their opportunity to cut off the axis with Iran and make Lebanon a country for the Lebanese. That is the goal, and in the future, we can live as good neighbors with them.
After 60 days of this ceasefire agreement, Israel will go out from Lebanon to the border?
There is an agreement, and there are conditions within the agreement that must be implemented. Among them is ensuring that Hezbollah does not infiltrate the Lebanese army and that there are no attempts by Hezbollah to maintain combat equipment in areas near Israel while ensuring Hezbollah's withdrawal behind the Litani River. They must respect the agreement. If they do, we will see how things go from there.
Mr. Cohen, are you worried from that your photo is a target of the Houthi?
I don't appear to you to be worried. I feel very secure in Israel. We do not only have the best offensive capabilities in the world, but also some of the best defensive capabilities globally. The one who should be worried is Abdul Malik al-Houthi. If he continues down this path, he will end up exactly like Nasrallah and Sinwar.
Can Israel do it?
Israel has proven it can reach anyone, anywhere. We have reached places far more complex than Yemen.
But the Houthi they are working with Iran, for Iran. Why didn't you go to Iran instead going all the time to the Houthi and make strikes there and attack them once a week or 2 weeks?
As long as we do not deal with the head of the snake, which is Iran, there will be no stability in the Middle East. It is important to note that we have no conflict with the Iranian people. Israel had good relations with Iran until 1979. I believe that one day there will be relations between Israel and the people of Iran. We have no conflict with them. Our conflict is with the Iranian leadership, the extremist Islamist leadership that harms people, infringes on human rights, destabilizes the Middle East, and works against Israel. Iran must understand that it must abandon its nuclear weapons plans and stop funding terrorist organizations. Iran must focus on Iran. We see that the Iranian people have no future, no prospects, and low living standards. The per capita income in Israel is 10 times that of Iran. Those who focus on their own country and relations with the West achieve a better standard of living. Learn from Israel.
Mr. Cohen, I want to ask you something else. When you were a foreign minister, you met the foreign minister of Libya, Mrs. Najla El-Manqoush. Can you tell us about this meeting, why and how, and what you discussed with her?
The meeting's purpose was to improve Libya's relations with the West. That was the goal of the meeting. We have no conflict with Libya. There are many Jews in Israel who are from Libya, and they would be happy to visit their country. Therefore, we have no conflict with Libya. It is in Libya's interest to open up to the West. Otherwise, it will continue drowning in its internal crises.
Mr. Cohen, thank you very much.
Our Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
After a two-year vacuum, Lebanon has finally elected its new president, Lebanese Army Commander, President Joseph Aoun. I'm your host, Shadan Hammam, and my special guest today is former MP and businessman Sami Fatfat. Hello, Mr. Fatfat. It's great to have you with us today, and congratulations on the election of the new president, putting an end to the political deadlock. Now, before we get into it, let's watch this clip together.
I pledge to exercise my role as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and President of the Supreme Defense Council so that I can work through them to confirm the state's right to monopolize the carrying of weapons.
Now, that was Lebanon's newly elected president, Joseph Aoun, delivering his inauguration speech in front of parliament. Now, Sami, as a Lebanese, how did that make you feel?
Well, we actually needed to hear this. I'm pretty sure that most Lebanese people felt goosebumps watching the president's speech. Personally, I felt a sense of relief. We have endured a lot, especially coming out of a very destructive war with Israel, and we needed some sort of hope and optimism. As for the issues, he spoke about reforming the judicial system and fighting corruption, disarming armed groups. These challenges we've been discussing for what feels like forever now. In 2019, there was an uprising in 17th of October 2019. This uprising, these issues were brought back to the forefront when the youth took to the streets and demanded change. At the time, the circumstances were very different, both regionally and domestically. But unfortunately, the movement failed largely because we were under significant Iranian influence. For the first time in years, we feel like there's a solid chance to rebuild our country, and this really fills us with optimism for the future.
I want to dissect that speech a bit further. Aoun pledged to fight corruption and, more importantly, to disarm any group, an apparent allusion to Hezbollah. This is the first time a Lebanese president has ever made such a speech in his opening speech to parliament. What does it mean for Hezbollah and its political supporters?
It's clear that the balance of power in the region has shifted, and even within Lebanon, the public opinion has changed. In his speech, President Aoun explicitly said that the Lebanese army has the right to defend the country. Notably, all MPs clapped except Hezbollah's MPs, reflecting the overwhelming support of 90% of the Lebanese people for this stance. Historically, Hezbollah, let's say, were justified as three things: as a deterrent against Israel, a means to protect Lebanon, but also, let's say, a safeguard for the Shia community. However, none of the justifications have held true over time. Today, it's important to engage with the Shia community, and we have to assure them that while the regional dynamics are changing, no sect will be abandoned or marginalized. Rebuilding Lebanon requires the full participation of the Shia as an essential component in the country. Practically speaking, we have to say that Hezbollah's weapons no longer serve any function in this context. The collapse of the Syrian regime has severed their land, air, and sea connections with Iran, but also the destruction of the Syrian weapon factories has directly impacted Hezbollah resources. And that's a major problem for them.
So you think President Joseph Aoun kind of has like a leverage or a good starting point, given that Hezbollah has been targeted by Israel?
I think he has far less issues than any president had before. And that's due to his actions and the actions of many politicians that led to the state that we are today.
Do you truly believe that Hezbollah will agree to surrender all its arms to the Lebanese state? Can Hezbollah be content by just being a political group without its military power?
Well, they have to surrender their arms. Of course, here we are talking about a full implementation of the UN Resolution 1701. The 1701 implementation, first of all, is key to protecting the Lebanese army. And it's especially with the support with the of the UNIFIL. The resolution ensures that no armed groups other than the state security forces, such as the army and police, have the right to carry weapons in Lebanon. If the resolution 1701 is fully enforced, there will be no arms in Hezbollah's possession, and thus no potential clashes between Hezbollah and the army.
Speaking of clashes, President Aoun now faces a few daunting tasks, from overseeing a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel to save the country from its worst economic crisis. What do you think will be his biggest challenge?
Let's start by saying that President Aoun has set the bar very high, to be honest, and I'm very good with that. But so much that there's some Lebanese are saying that if he delivers like 30% of his speech, they will be very grateful. However, he will face significant obstacles, particularly from parties benefiting from the current state of lawlessness. The biggest challenge will be standing firm and refusing not to make compromises with any political factions. One of the most powerful statements he made was no one is above the law and no one is protected. This single sentence lays a foundation for building a state, and it marks the first step towards an independent judiciary.
Now, going back to the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, we can say that it's a fragile one. One of the conditions to preserve it is the deployment of the Lebanese forces along the southern border. So Aoun comes from a military background, which adds, an air of trust. However, do you think he can ensure that his troops are not caught in the crossfire between Israeli troops and Hezbollah?
If the resolution 1701 is enforced, there will be no arms with Hezbollah, thus no clashes between Hezbollah and the army. Additionally, we have to say that we are witnessing a significant U.S. pressure on Israel to withdraw from the occupied areas within the agreed upon time frame. In his last appearance, Hochstein was very clear about this point. The preamble of the latest agreement of the resolution of 1701 contains a critical statement that says no party in Lebanon shall possess weapons except the state security agencies, including the army, the internal security, the general security, but also they mentioned the municipal police.
Okay, so President Aoun is backed by the U.S. Can this mean that Lebanon might be entering an era of potential peace or even normalization ties with Israel?
I think it's too soon to speak about normalization with Israel. It's too early to discuss this. The Israeli is still seen as an occupying force or an occupier. However, the region is shifting, and it's shifting rapidly.
President Aoun did mention that he wants to grow the army to protect Lebanon against any Israeli attack.
And as a Lebanese citizen, we must focus on unity now and on rebuilding our devastated country.
Speaking of rebuilding, do you see a future in Lebanon where the diaspora are returning back?
In my opinion, we are entering a new phase, one that establishes the rule of law for all citizens. No one is above the law and no one is protected. This sentence alone is a good omen and the foundation for building a strong state. People are optimistic, and we hope we are really hoping for the best. I think in the near future, the mood will shift in the country, and I think, yes, in the near future, people will be coming back to Lebanon.
If you were president today, Sami, what would be your top priority on the agenda?
If I were president, first of all, I cannot be president. I can be prime minister. I'm a Sunni, so it's impossible for me to be president.
True.
But my top priority today is to attract foreign investments to Lebanon, reattract the youth that left Lebanon at the early stages, just to find a much more secure country, and to assure to everyone, to all citizens of Lebanon, that we do have the chance to rebuild this beautiful country again.
Recently, a heartfelt video of you reuniting with your Syrian uncle for the first time in years was circulating social media. Let's take a look. Sami, tell us more about the story behind that video.
I actually went to Syria 3 days after the fall of the Assad regime. I went out of curiosity, and we have my father has a stepbrother in Syria that I've met when I was young, but I've never seen him since then. So I had the chance to connect with him, to contact him and to see him, and it was an amazing moment for me, and it was an amazing moment for him also. So he met me when I was like maybe 10 years old, and now seeing me again, going to Syria, and it was crazy. It was like a dream.
Were you bored from Syria? Is that why you haven't seen him in a long time?
I know for sure that my dad has a warrant against him by the Syrian government, by the ex-Syrian Assad regime. And when we used to speak publicly about the Syrian regime, I was very harsh on TV, and I was very loud regarding the atrocity of the Syrian regime. Mm-hmm. So I'm pretty sure that if I were to go there before the fall of the Assad regime, I would have major problems. But now that this regime is gone, both Lebanon and Syria have the chance to build amazing diplomatic relationship and civil relationship.
Former MP, Mr. Sami Fatfat, it was a pleasure having you today.
Thank you.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Mr. Geir Pedersen, thank you for giving us Al Arabiya News Channel this interview. So you are here in Riyadh participating the meeting, the ministerial meeting about Syria. What is the most important things you agreed upon today?
Thank you so much. A pleasure being here together with you. It was a very good meeting. It was the second meeting. As you know, we met 3 weeks back in Aqaba, where I think at the time there were lots of questions about what was happening in Syria. We met only 1 week after the collapse of the Assad regime. Now a few more weeks have passed, and obviously within the international community there were more questions. And this time also the caretaker foreign minister of the new Syrian government was also there. So this was an opportunity for him to listen to the international community and for the international community to be listening to what he has to say and the other way around. So I think it was a very good and very important meeting.
So how do you describe the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and did you know that something is cooking?
I think we were all surprised by the speed and how it happened. I had been warning for years that if a real political process didn't start in Syria, we could risk seeing something dramatic happen. And what started on the 27th of November last year and ended on the 8th of December with the collapse of the Assad regime, I think came as a complete surprise to nearly everyone. And I think this also explains a lot of the questions being asked. We have to remember that HTS, which is sort of the dominant force that took power in Damascus, was actually a UN-listed terrorist group. And the fact that this group is now in charge, of course, raised a lot of questions, and I think some nervousness, not only among the international community, but also among Syrians. But then we very early on, we heard, of course, very positive messaging coming out from al-Shara in particular, where he emphasized that Syria should be for everyone, for all communities, all religious sects, and that it would be inclusive. The new Syria would be for everyone. Then he also said that they needed to take care of the state institutions, that there should be no collapse of state institutions. And then he said that they wanted to give priority to public services, to security, and so on. And I think this was met with relief, first and foremost from the Syrians, but also from the international community. And then I think the question being asked from many Syrians and from the international community was, would this actually be implemented? And I think we have now witnessed a few weeks, and I think we have a clearer picture.
How do you describe today HTC and how you describe also the relation with Ahmad al-Shara?
I think what we have seen is, frankly speaking, a remarkable development. I think today it is 5 weeks since they took power in Damascus. And of course, they don't control the whole of Syria. That's also sort of an important part of this. But I think the fact that we have relative stability in so many areas is extremely important. So I think, while I think many were very nervous that things could start to go wrong very quickly, I think we are now seeing, by and large, that it has been a positive development, but with a few issues. And of course, outside of the big cities, we have seen what I would call a few security incidents. We have seen some attacks on some of the minorities, which I know that the new caretaker authority is also looking into. And then I think we have seen some questions being raised by the fact that now the caretaker government is basically the same government that came from Idlib. But at the same time, and we heard that today here in Riyadh, is that we are getting assurances that after 3 months, plus minus, there will be a new transitional body that will come after we have had a national conference in Syria. And that this transitional body will be inclusive of all, so that no one should be felt excluded in Syria. And I think that is a reassuring message coming out. So to answer your question, I think we see that there is a lot of challenges. Some of these challenges will be with us for months, maybe years to come. But there is an understanding that we can work together on this. We can work together with the caretaker government, hopefully with the transitional body when that is in place, and the international community is ready to come in fully behind and support the Syrian people.
Do you have a time frame about the stage or the transitional period يعني next stage, يعني after the 3 months, and what about the dialogue, who's participating?
Now listen, this of course is first and foremost the responsibility of the Syrian people. And what we want to see is that what is leading up to what we call the national conference, the national dialogue, whatever we call it, that this is a really inclusive process that sends a message of hope to the Syrian people, that it is credible and that the Syrian people believe it is credible. Of course, we all understand that things in Syria will not immediately be perfect. You know, in this world, nothing is perfect. But what is important is that it is credible and inclusive, so that the Syrian people are willing to come in and to contribute to how it is developing. And then It is, as I said, up to that national conference, or however they want to organize this, to find some kind of an agreement on the next phase. We have heard different things. I think Al-Shara said in an interview with you that certain things could take 2 to 3 years. Other things, elections, could take longer, 4 to 5 years. But hopefully these are things that will be discussed by the Syrians themselves. And we are here to hopefully be able to support, to give advice, but again, for the Syrians themselves to decide.
There is 2 core principles in the 2254. First, that should be a political transition in Syria that should be led and owned by the Syrian people. Is that possible? And what about Assad?
You're absolutely right. You could say there are 2 core principles in Security Council Resolution 2254. It's about that it needs to be a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned transitional process that should lead to a transitional body.
Sure.
That again will lead to a new constitution and free and fair elections. The second and important principle is the protection of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence. So these are the 2 important things. But the point with Security Council Resolution 2254 was, of course, also that it had language about negotiations between the government and the opposition. And this is obviously no longer relevant. There is no one proposing that we do negotiations with Mr. Assad in Moscow. So that's why we are now working on the possibility to see if we can also make some changes and maybe adopt a new resolution. That is up to the Security Council to decide. But I think it would be a good way to to move forward, to tell also the Syrian people that the Security Council and the international community understand that there is a new beginning and that we are willing to work with the Syrian people based on the core principles of that resolution, but that we see that something new is happening. Then on the situation in the northeast, obviously this is a major challenge, and it is extremely important that we find a political solution to this. And I was pleased to hear that there had been a meeting between the SDF and the HDS in Damascus. I understand there is no agreement yet, but hopefully we will give it time so that it could develop into a political solution. That means that all of Syria is now united behind the possibility of have a new beginning for all Syrians, all communities.
So the second core principle, you talk about it, the protecting the sovereignty and independency and the safety of the Syria lands. Okay, so is this principle still alive, and we are seeing the daily Israeli incursions into the Syrian lands?
I'm afraid you're absolutely right that we are seeing a daily violation from the Israeli government against Syria. And I've said many times, and I can repeat it now, this needs to stop. The violation of Syria's sovereignty, the invasion, the occupation of new land is in violation of international law and the principle that the UN is based on. It's not only that, but it is also happening at a time when we have what I would call a critical transitional process in Syria. And instead of complicating that, all neighbors should show a positive interest in seeing that we have stability and a new beginning for Syria. So this is a huge responsibility also on the Israeli side.
If Mr. al-Shara do what they are saying, that want an inclusive process with all the parties in Syria, then you believe it's the right time to remove the sanction, and what are the guarantees we'll ask for?
No, I think this is a very important question. And I really do believe that if we now see a truly inclusive political transitional process that leads to an inclusive transitional body, and with the process leading to a new constitution and a new elections, hopefully, then yes, there is, I think, a deep willingness from the international community to come in and to help. And at least I can promise I will do then my utmost to make sure that sanctions will be lifted. because we know very well that if sanctions is not lifted, it will not really be possible to rebuild Syria. So we need to see two things, that the transitional process is moving forward and that the international community respond to that. But I can tell you, after listening to my colleagues from the international community here today, I'm confident that this should be possible to achieve. I'm not saying that it will be, an uncomplicated process. There are always hiccups in processes like this. But we need to be very clear on this, that this is absolutely necessary to be able to see that we start to see the rebuilding of Syria, that will end the poverty that so many are now living in. We have now close to 17 million people in Syria in need of humanitarian assistance. And as you know, we want Syrian refugees to be able to return. We have now maybe had 500,000 since the 400,000 came from Lebanon. We have a little bit more than 100,000 after the 8th of December. So more than 500,000 people coming in, all of them needing, humanitarian assistance. But we need to make sure it's sustainable. And that can only happen if we are really rebuilding Syria. And that needs a lot of international support, new businesses, and the end of sanctions.
The Guardian newspaper published a report about a few days ago about the next stage of Syria, and you are supporting a democratic transition, but you are facing resistance from within the country because because the UN is unpopular and there is no trust about the UN. Because also the UN let down the Syrians. How do you respond to this talk, and how do you reassure the Syrians?
I think we have to be honest and to say that we all let the Syrian people down during the 14 years or close to 14 years of war and conflict. We were not able to really live up to the expectations of the Syrian people when it comes to nearly everything. And after the collapse of the Assad regime, we have now seen all the brutality that regime brought through. So it's understandable that there is a lot of anger against the international community. And I would say it was an international, I think, a collective failure. And of course, the UN is part of that. And for many, we are the face of that. And there is only one way out of that, and that is to start to rebuild trust. And the way we can do that is to say that we are here now to serve the Syrian people, hopefully in close coordination and cooperation with first the caretaker authority and then with the new transitional body. And as I said, I think the international community is united now behind a willingness to come behind and to support the new Syria. And why is that? Because I think no one can afford that Syria do not succeed. The Syrians can't afford it, and the international community can't afford it. So here there is a joint interest in trying to move forward.
So the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with its regional and international influence, how do you describe its role in establishing the new Syria?
I think the fact that we met in Riyadh today at the initiative of the Kingdom, I think says a lot. I think it re-emphasizes what I have emphasized already, that there is a willingness from Syria's neighbors, from the Gulf states, and from the broader Arab region to make sure that Syria succeeds. And I think the message from Saudi Arabia today was that they want to be at the forefront of that process. And I think that is welcome by everyone to see this. And in my discussions today with the Saudi authorities, I think we agreed that there is a huge potential, there are many challenges, and that we can only solve it if we work together. We work with the Syrians, and we work together as an international community.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers.
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, after months of negotiations, Israel and Hamas agreed to a phased ceasefire and hostage release deal in Gaza, which it's hoped will put an end to what's been 15 months of fighting in the Palestinian territory. But less than 24 hours after that ceasefire deal was struck, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was accusing Hamas of reneging on parts of the agreement, saying that they're trying to, quote, extort last-minute concessions. Well, this deal will allow for a surge in humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza, which age groups say is needed urgently. Coming up, we'll ask a spokesperson from UNICEF how this has affected children in the enclave. And drawing a line under a political career that spanned half a century, the outgoing US President Joe Biden delivers a farewell speech from the Oval Office in which he warns of the dangers that lie ahead for the United States. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the latest on the ceasefire deal that was struck last night between Israel and Hamas. All these past 15 months of war, just to remind you, was sparked by the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October 2023, the deadliest ever attack on Israel, which resulted in the deaths of 1,210 people. Well, Palestinian militants also took 250 people hostage on that deadly day. 94 of them are still being held in Gaza, though the Israeli military says that of them, 34 are believed to be dead. Well, Israel's retaliatory campaign in Gaza has resulted in the deaths of more than 46,000 people, the majority of them believed to be civilians. Well, after months of intense diplomatic efforts, Israel and Hamas have now reached a ceasefire deal, which is due to take effect on the 19th of January. Well, this deal will also include an exchange of hostages and prisoners. Well, for the latest, we can speak now to journalist Noga Tarnopolsky, who joins us from Jerusalem. Noga, great to have you with us. Israel accusing Hamas of backtracking on parts of this ceasefire and hostage release deal already. Of course, this truce is due to take effect on Sunday. I mean, is it in serious jeopardy at this stage?
I think it's basically a done deal. I think we're seeing some internal Jerusalem maneuvering here with the Prime Minister Netanyahu trying to kind of kick the can down till tomorrow if he can push a cabinet vote. Till then, trying to shore up some of his more recalcitrant ministers, and also by accusing Hamas of trying to blackmail Israel at the last moment. Absent any other evidence that that's happening, he appears to be trying to convince his base that, in fact, he is fighting for them down to the wire. But I don't have the impression that the agreement is actually in danger right now.
And when Israel says Hamas is trying to extort the negotiators with some last-minute concessions, I mean, do we have any idea as to what all of this relates to?
Not really. One of the Prime Minister's statements implied that it had something to do with the Philadelphia corridor, which is the name for the border between Gaza and Egypt. It seems unclear. It seems to me like it's more kind of maneuvering. That said, Netanyahu is in a bit of a pickle because this is supposed to be a three-phase deal. So right now, it does appear that he will have the votes in cabinet, which he needs under law, to ratify this. So he does have the votes to pass the first phase. The second phase is supposed to enter into negotiations on day 16 of the first phase. He absolutely does not have the votes in cabinet to pass the second phase, which would have more far-reaching effects, including the complete and total withdrawal of all of any aspects of the Israeli army from the entire Gaza Strip. So I think he's also trying to kind of reposition himself ahead of that new negotiation, which is going to be even tougher for him.
What was the reaction like, Noga, last night when the news emerged that after all of these, down-to-the-wire talks and lots of false starts and lots of perhaps misguided optimism over previous months, that finally a deal had been struck? How did people respond to that?
It was a very ambiguous and complicated response on the Israeli side. There's a lot of heartbreak. There is deep pain over the fact that this deal was on the table way back in May, and so many lives could have been saved in the interim, including those 6 hostages who were executed on September 1 or August 30th, including the American Hirsch Goldberg Polin, and many soldiers whose parents now in public are claiming that their children are dying in vain. These are very young conscripted soldiers who've made no choice to participate in this. There's also a lot of fear in Israel that the government will not follow through with phase 2, and thus 2/3 of the remaining hostages could be, relegated to an unknown future in Gaza. There's also, I would say, something between confusion and anger over the fact that it appears to have taken 2 American presidents to come to this deal that was on the table back in May, whereas the Israeli prime minister, who could have gone for it or made a real effort for it all along, seems almost a passive figure in the entire international stage. So a very complex response on the Israeli side.
And when it comes to apportioning credit, obviously lots of parties were involved in the talks: Qatar, Egypt, the United States, obviously Israel, obviously delegations from Hamas. But who does the average person in the street in Israel think deserves the credit for arriving at this point?
My sense is that right now Israelis are so kind of fearful and heartbroken that no one is going to get any credit in the Israeli heart until at least some hostages are seen coming home. I think it's too early for that. But what you do see among Israeli media, kind of macho media commentarists, is a lot of credit being given to Donald Trump. And I'm quoting now the senior diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz, who said, frankly, that it took Donald Trump strong-arming Netanyahu to get this deal done. I think too little credit is being given to Joe Biden, who spent months and months advancing this, and whose team, in fact, did write up the entire accord, which is finally going to be implemented.
And of course, people on the far right of the political spectrum in Israel have been particularly vocal in opposing this deal. They have described it as variously dangerous and disastrous. I mean, what sorts of levels of support do those kinds of arguments have?
There's a lot of doubt about this accord across the board in Israeli society, but most of those doubts don't come from that extreme right that you're mentioning. The extreme right has a very loud, very threatening minority of the Israeli public, but it happens to be that part of the Israeli public that voted in the most extremist parties of this government. So they have power over these ministers, and they may have some influence over tomorrow's vote, assuming the cabinet does convene, simply because they're the base that voted them in. The fact remains, it's a very small minority. It's less than 20% of Israelis who have those kind of harbor that ultra right-wing nationalist theocratic opposition to this deal. But I would emphasize, across the board, secular Israelis whose children go to the army, all sorts of families who have hostages in Gaza, most people seem to feel trepidation ahead of the implementation of this deal.
And just lastly, I'm just wondering what sort of a figure Prime Minister Netanyahu cut at this stage, because in recent months he's had lots of foreign policy and foreign affairs coups, we could call them, successes in various parts of the world, including severely degrading Hezbollah in Lebanon. We've seen the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, although I'm not sure even Benjamin Netanyahu claims much credit for that. But a lot of things have changed. And I'm just wondering, all of these things viewed together, Does Benjamin Netanyahu cut a stronger or a weaker figure than he did 15 months ago when the October 7th attacks took place?
He was a weak and unpopular prime minister before the war began. That was as a result of his effort to enact a sort of regime change, an anti-democratic regime change in Israel. Since the war has started, he has consistently gotten less and less popular. He's a very weak prime minister right now. He's very unpopular. He's also a very absent prime minister. You know, it's remarkable that the Qatari and the Americans and all of these leaders have spoken out about this. Even the Catholic Church put out a statement welcoming this agreement. Israeli leadership hasn't been heard from at all. Netanyahu seems to have been hunkered up somewhere. It's unclear if he doesn't dare face the Israeli public or he doesn't know what to say. What we do see is a weak and fractured government led by an unpopular prime minister, and he's trying right now to play it both ways. Israelis absolutely do see the fact that he's trying to tell the Americans one thing, tell Donald Trump, yes, we're going to see this deal through, and tell his own ministers, don't worry, we're not going to go beyond phase one. And that is not, I would say, sitting very well with the Israeli public right now.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Journalist Noga
Great talking with you, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Well, let's get some more analysis now on this ceasefire deal, and we can speak to Dr. Sarah Hosseini, who is the director of the British Palestinian Committee. Thank you so much for joining us from the UK, Dr. Hosseini. I'd just like to get your reaction. What went through your mind when you heard that the deal had finally, after months of waiting, been struck between the two sides?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of emotions, I think, is probably the answer to that. And as you said, you know, after 15 months of really relentless assault on our family and friends and loved ones, colleagues in Gaza, the reaction was that obviously this is both an imperative, things have happened, but long, long overdue. It should have happened 15 months ago. I think initially there's a sense of relief of all of us Palestinians everywhere in the world. You know, particularly for those in Gaza, so the doctors and the nurses, for example, who have continued to treat patients while Israeli tanks have been invading hospitals and destroying them. Teachers and academics who, you know, despite the systematic destruction of the education system, as you'll know, all 12 of Gaza's higher education institutions have been bombed to pieces, but the teachers and the academics are still teaching and the students are still taking vivas and things intense. And, you know, thinking about the rescue workers as well, who have risked their own lives to try and save people buried under the rubble after bombardment. And, you know, now we're faced with, 42 million tons of rubble that the UN thinks is going to take about 15 years to clear. So there's a sort of a relief mixed with grief. And then, of course, a deep sense of unease and a deep will, you know, we don't want to be naive and we don't want to be short-sighted about this. You know, this is not the first time Gaza's been attacked. It's not the first ceasefire. Israel spent decades carrying out its agenda of ethnic cleansing, its expansionist agenda to dispossess Palestinians from their homes. And the last 15 months has really just shown the world how far it's willing to go and also how far it's able to go with impunity from the international community. And among those, I class the UK government as being primary in terms of not only failing to uphold its duties to Palestinians, not only failing to hold Israel to account, but actually enabling this genocidal assault by continuing to provide, together with the US, billions of dollars of weapons, military support, diplomatic support, and so on.
Okay, well, I'm going to pick up on some of those points in just a moment, but I just want to ask you what you thought when you heard a little earlier on today that we had, you know, these reports of Israel accusing Hamas of backtracking on parts of the deal already. I mean, the deal hasn't even taken effect already, and yet we've got Israel saying that Hamas was trying to, quote, extort last-minute concessions. We were just talking to our correspondent, a correspondent in Jerusalem about this a little earlier on. She didn't seem to think it was necessarily meaning that the deal was in jeopardy as such, perhaps a bump in the road or perhaps a bit of show. What's your reading of it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not in the room, obviously, as you aren't either. But what I think I think all we can go on really is, first of all, the fact that we know that there will be spin around this, and second of all, that we have to look at the track record. And I think it's worth pointing out, this agreement is almost word for word an agreement that was rejected by Israel, according to the mediators, back in May of 2024. Just thinking about the unimaginable devastation that's happened since then at the hands of Israeli forces. But to say that, there's a track record here. Israel has relayed on ceasefires in the past. We have, phased withdrawals, which is a big part of this deal, is something that always raises concern and worry amongst Palestinians. The case in point being the Oslo Accords of the 90s, whereby Israel was supposed to have withdrawn from all of the occupied territories of Gaza and across Palestine by 1999. You see where we are today. So I think we have to really take these things until we have concrete, facts. I think we have to look at the track record of what's happened in the past here.
Yeah, and what's so unprecedented about these latest talks and the round of talks that resulted in the deal that we now have is that you had two US administrations working side by side on that. And that's really quite unprecedented, isn't it? I'm just wondering how decisive you think it was to have the outgoing Biden administration sitting alongside the incoming Trump administration and, ultimately delivering the goods.
I mean, it's difficult to say because both administrations have been culpable of, as I said before, supporting, effectively aiding and abetting this genocide by continuing to provide military support, millions of dollars of military support. When Trump was in office the last time around, he approved the annexation of the Golan Heights and other areas. So it's difficult to say. So far, we've seen no signs of the US or indeed anyone holding Israel to account. So yeah, I'm not sure how significant it will be.
So who gets the credit then? We had all these different parties negotiating for months. In Qatar, there were the Egyptians present, the Qataris obviously, there were representatives of Hamas, Israel, of the United States. Who, therefore, do you think gets the credit for having delivered the ceasefire deal?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, Tom. I'm not sure it's about credit. I think it's about this is something that is, looking at the devastation that this has caused. I think it's about what happens next and what happens in the future. So it's going to be the credit will go to whoever can hold this agreement down and whoever can do what's necessary. Now, what we have noticed, what we have realised from this past 15 months, which we should have already known, is that there can be no military solution to this issue. So, early on, Netanyahu and Israeli leaders claimed to eliminate everything, planned total, destruction of the Gaza Strip, and it hasn't happened 15 months later. And I think that's really important because it just goes again to show that this will not be solved militarily. This needs a political solution, and the political solution has to begin with accountability. It has to begin with respect for international law and implementing, the dozens and dozens of international legal opinions and frameworks that are already in place. We know Israel's leaders have arrest warrants out against them. There's a trial for genocide at the ICJ against Israel. So there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of ways that countries like the UK, like the US could apply, like Egypt, could apply pressure, whether that's through sanctions, a 2-way arms embargo, that would then actually get us towards some kind of long-term solution. Because again, we know this didn't begin 15 months ago. This is a part of a decades-long project of ethnic cleansing, of occupation, of siege. And so we can't be naive and we can't be short-sighted and we can't have a short memory on this.
Sure, and I should just point out that my question about credit really stemmed from the comments that were being made by the incoming president and the outgoing president, both of them claiming credit for having achieved this deal. I'd just like to ask you what you think Hamas's role is going to be moving forward. I mean, do you see Hamas having some sort of involvement in the governance of Gaza, or do you think that's something that the authorities in Ramallah are going to have to take care of?
I think that's a question for the Palestinian people as a whole, rather than just an individual. I think what I will say is that self-determination is an inalienable right, and it's something that has to absolutely be fulfilled if there's going to be any future that is a peaceful one. And so any initiative going forward, any form of rule, anything has to centre the Palestinian people as a whole. And everybody and all governments who are involved in this should be actively rejecting any initiative that seeks to bypass Palestinian civil society in some way. So, I spoke about the universities before. The universities might be destroyed, the buildings, but the professors, the institutions are still there, and they need to be strengthened and need to rebuild the education system as one example. So I think, going forward, what needs to happen really is that we need to make sure that there's urgent accountability, and that whatever solution in the future is there is something that centres Palestinians and doesn't bypass them, which we've seen time and time again in the past and has not worked.
And what is your feeling about the level of support for Hamas amongst Palestinian people, not just in Gaza, but in all Palestinian communities? Do you think there is a sense of they've done something quite extraordinary, which was to maintain 15 months of they survived 15 months of bombardment, intense bombardment by Israel? I mean, obviously they're going to be framing this as being something of a victory, that they're severely weakened but not destroyed. But what do you think the people of Gaza, for example, think of Hamas now?
Yeah, I think the people of Gaza are concerned with trying to stay alive in this last few days before the ceasefire comes into being. I think, have just demonstrated, and again, this war by Israel has been against the entire population of the Gaza Strip and across Palestine. There've been, a number of attacks and Palestinians, like 7,000 or so Palestinians killed in the West Bank in the same time. So I think we have to really think about this as an attack on the Palestinian people as a whole, and look at the courage and the civic commitment that we've seen from Palestinians in Gaza as a whole. This is something that has their steadfastness as a whole has really inspired the world. And I think it's so important that we now do everything in our power from the outside to ensure that they don't have to go through this again, because this is the 6th time now since 2008 that Gaza's been bombarded.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Dr. Sarah Hosseini, Director of the British Palestinian Committee. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We can get some more analysis now from Professor Kamal Hawash, Palestinian academic, writer and analyst, who joins us from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'd just like to get your first reaction, really, to the news of this deal between Israel and Hamas. Is it a good deal?
Well, there have been so many false starts. We've been hopeful that a deal would be struck, and so I welcome this particular deal because it will bring relief, hopefully, to the people of Gaza, who have been subjected to the most barbaric, atrocious attack by Israel, and who still face, even though securing the deal and the guns stopping would be fantastic, their future remains uncertain because there's been so much destruction. Many of them will not have homes to go back to. And of course, it will also involve the release of hostages, which everybody wants to see, and some Palestinian hostages in Israeli prisons who have been there without any judgment, and therefore Israel is holding them effectively as hostages.
Indeed. And, we saw months and months of false starts, what looked like pretty fruitless negotiations. To what do you attribute the fact that this deal was finally struck yesterday? What did it?
I think we have to acknowledge that the fact that President Trump, or President-elect Trump, will be coming to office on Monday, he had made a pretty clear message, as he does, that if there was no deal, if the hostages were not released, there would be, all hell to pay for in the Middle East. So that focused the minds. I also think his representative was apparently pretty tough with the Israelis, telling them this had to be agreed, because this is effectively the same deal that that was on the table back in May, that Joe Biden sort of took pride in formulating, which Hamas accepted then. But it was the Israelis who prevaricated, and Netanyahu continued to add more and more conditions. So it could have been struck earlier than this. It will not bring, as far as we know, the release of all Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails, but the release of all the hostages. But this is a good start in that sense.
Indeed. And I mean, it's hard to believe there's much left of Hamas after 15 months of devastating and highly concentrated bombardment of a very small territory, geographically speaking. How weak is Hamas? And when you consider the high-profile killings of high-profile individuals in that organization, what's left of Hamas?
It's difficult to judge, apart from the people who we know have been killed, i.e. Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh. What is left of Hamas, because Israel doesn't come forward with figures to say that they have killed so many fighters. In fact, they don't even acknowledge. They will just say that the figures that are produced from Gaza include those who've been killed from Hamas. But it's very difficult to judge how many there are. What we hear from people on the ground is that, in fact, because of the severity of Israel's attack on Gaza and the fact that many young men have lost most of their families, if not all of them, that more have been recruited, which makes, begs the question, what happens after the guns fall silent and all of this stops? So therefore, there is, whether you look at Hamas or not, the Palestinians have to come together to provide a united leadership that will rule over both Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, because that is the way that, the international community will have confidence in the rebuilding of Gaza, and that the push towards a solution, what majority of the world believes is the two-state solution, is so important now to, first of all, for the Palestinians to attain their rights of dignity, freedom, justice, and equality, but that also there would be no need for any fighting in the future between the two sides. However, we know for certain that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Knesset, and therefore Ben-Gvir and Smotrich's ministers are against the Palestinian state. So there's a lot of hard work to be done, and the world must take action to say to Israel, enough is enough. Yes, what happened on the 7th of October was a severe attack on Israelis, but for there to be peace in the future, there has to be recognition of Palestinians' rights, and that they should have freedom, justice, and equality, and a state of their own. I also think that Israel should be made to pay for the destruction that it has caused in Gaza, because so much of it was unnecessary. It was deliberate to try and push the Palestinians out, and therefore accountability would say that the International Criminal Court should have Netanyahu and Gallant brought to it, because there are warrants issued for them, and indeed for any that people on the Palestinian side that it is chasing. So all of these go hand in hand. There has to be accountability. There has to be a push for peace, and it won't be just nice words that will bring a Palestinian state. There has to be action by the international community, starting with the United States, but also the UK, where I am as well, actually recognizing a Palestinian state and pushing for there to be reality on the ground of the Palestinians being free in their homeland.
You mentioned Donald Trump at the start of your previous answer, saying he has to be credited with having got the two sides together and that he'd been tough on both sides. Do you see him carrying on in that same vein? And if he does, do you see him being able to bring about the creation of a Palestinian state? I mean, is there a sense amongst Palestinians that he's also on their side?
I mean, in his previous tenure, he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, moved the American embassy, recognized the Golan Heights, the illegally occupied Golan Heights, as part of Israel. And he produced a peace plan that the Palestinians could not accept. So on that, you would think things will not be moving in a positive direction. But he's a disruptor. We know that you would be surprised as to the things he comes up with. For example, that he wants the Greenland states. Who would have thought that? How many people had heard of Greenland? But he's that kind of person. One of the difficulties, I think, will be that he's surrounding himself and his administration with pretty Zionist people, including the person he suggested as Secretary of State and the American ambassador, the proposed American ambassador. For example, the ambassador says there's no West Bank, it's Judea and Samaria. So he's basically saying that Israel exists over the whole of historic Palestine. Now, what needs to happen is for Trump to say that's not going to bring peace. Israel must stop building settlements, must vacate the settlements, take its people out of Palestinian land for there to be a proper state. And what they would find is that the Palestinians on their side, that's what they want. They're not born to want to fight another people. They just want to live in their homeland in dignity, freedom, and independence. So if he can begin to bring that about, I think he would do the whole region a really great service. And that will also contribute to what the Americans want, which is to bring Saudi Arabia into the normalization process. If that doesn't happen, I doubt if Saudis would come along, and we'll continue to have tensions for quite a bit of time to come.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, though. Professor Kamal Hawash, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for having me.
Well, less than 24 hours after the ceasefire deal was announced, Israeli forces are reported to have killed at least 82 people in Gaza. That's according to medical sources. Meanwhile, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called for a major boost in aid to alleviate what he called the immense suffering of the Palestinian people, although he did welcome the news of this truce. Well, for more, we can speak now to Tess Ingram, a spokesperson for UNICEF, who joins us from the Jordanian capital, Amman. Tess, great to have you with us. I'd just like to start by asking for your reaction to the news of this deal, and if you can tell us what it's going to mean for the humanitarian efforts there in Gaza.
Our immediate reaction is relief and hope. This is something that we've been calling for almost 15 months now. So we're certainly heartened by the news that this could come into action. But of course, it needs to be implemented and it needs to be sustained. And beyond that, we need the enabling conditions on the ground to ensure that our work as a humanitarian aid agency is enabled, because there's still so many challenges that remain. There's obviously an enormous humanitarian catastrophe for children on the ground. And while the news of the ceasefire means that children might no longer be from threat of bombs and bullets, a child with malnutrition needs the aid. And for us, that requires really scaling up and circumnavigating the really intense challenges that we've faced in the Gaza Strip with aid delivery since the very beginning of this conflict.
The Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, says that humanitarian aid is urgently needed there in Gaza. Just tell us a bit more about the situation, because I'm assuming it varies pretty considerably from one area to another.
That's right. I think that throughout all of the Gaza Strip, aid is desperately needed. The situation, of course, has been most acute in the north of the Gaza Strip, where access from humanitarian aid agencies like UNICEF has been incredibly restricted, and the people there have not got as much aid. But of course, everybody in Gaza needs the basics, which is horrific after 15 months that we're still talking about meeting people's basic needs: food, water, shelter, medicines, clothes. But that's where we're at. And I think when we think about the scale of the crisis, it's helpful to put it in the terms of real children. You know, we've seen repeatedly children dying from malnutrition, children languishing in hospital with wounds that can't be treated because there's not enough medicine, children being crushed in line for flour, children being injured, losing limbs. So there's so many physical and emotional scars now in Gaza, and the job ahead is, one, to stem the bleeding, and then two, try and get in and do whatever we can to help people.
Yeah, it's often said, and I'd just like to get your take on this, that it's children that bear the brunt of wars in general, not just this one, but other ones. Is that something you've seen? And maybe you can give us an example of why that's said.
We've said since the beginning of this conflict that Gaza is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child, and that children are bearing the brunt of this conflict. And that's because children are uniquely vulnerable to wars. They're uniquely vulnerable to explosive weapons, particularly when they're set off in populated areas, because By nature, children are often outside playing, and they're smaller than adults, so they're more in line of fire. Children are more vulnerable to malnutrition, to dehydration, to hypothermia. And of course, just in the last few weeks, there were reports of 8 babies dying of hypothermia in the Gaza Strip. So children really do bear the brunt of war. That's not an exaggeration. And in the Gaza Strip, where 50% of the population are children, every second person in the Gaza Strip is a child, I think that's something worth us remembering.
Yeah, we were just saying before we crossed to you that there's been yet more violence. I mean, the deal may have been agreed thousands of kilometres away, but on the ground that hasn't translated yet into peace. And I'm just assuming that for your colleagues, your UNICEF colleagues, working in conditions like this are incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous for them, and it continues to be dangerous. So how much of a difference is it going to mean when the fighting actually stops?
It is the most dangerous place in the world to be a humanitarian. I was in a convoy in Gaza in April that was shot at, and many of my other colleagues have experienced similar situations or worse. We've lost so many humanitarian colleagues in Gaza over the last 15 months. So it is really dangerous, not just for us, but of course for the people that we're there to serve. The hope is that a ceasefire remedies that, at least from the sky, and that we can get on with the work. But it doesn't solve all of the security challenges that we face. Of course, there are unexploded ordinances now scattered across Gaza, and there is insecurity in the fact of criminal gangs who are relentlessly searching for aid that they can loot, including from our trucks. And that poses a threat to our staff and to the people that we're distributing the aid to.
And in terms of the aid getting through, the Rafah border crossing from Egypt's been closed for quite some time now. Do you think that's going to reopen soon? And how much of a difference will that make?
It would make a great difference if we can get that crossing open. We're really calling for all available crossings to be open so that we can flood the Gaza Strip with aid. We need to make sure that we're getting aid in from the north, from the south, and then that aid crosses Gaza so that we're really making sure that everybody is reached. But of course, this has not happened since the beginning of the war. So it remains a challenge, and it remains to be seen whether we're going to be able to do that. So we really are calling for all of these crossings to be open, for all of these access restrictions to be lifted, and for these challenges that we face inside the Gaza Strip, unexploded ordinances, criminal activity, to be remedied so that we have the best chance of serving the people of Gaza and providing them with the aid that they so desperately need.
One of the big challenges looking forwards is going to be what happens to the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, because there's a ban on that agency that's due to take effect later on this month. I don't know what you think is going to happen with regards to that ban and what you think the future of that agency is going to be.
I wish I had a crystal ball. I don't know. All I can say is that UNRWA is integral to the humanitarian operations in the Gaza Strip. And as we approach this ceasefire, removing UNRWA would be catastrophic. You can't take the backbone out of something and then expect it to function properly. And that's what we're facing if UNRWA is removed from operations in Palestine, including in Gaza. They really are the ones that have the most staff on the ground, really coordinate a lot of the response and provide services that no other UN agency can do. So we've been saying for months now that UNRWA is irreplaceable in Gaza, and that's a fact, that without UNRWA, the entire humanitarian system would really struggle. So that's a threat that looms over us, particularly worrisome with the ceasefire ahead.
Yeah, and after what's been 400 days of displacement and starvation, clearly thousands of people want to return to their homes, which is a completely normal wish after being displaced all over the territory these last 15 months. But what percentage of those people are actually going to have a home to go back to? I know you don't have an exact number, but what sorts of numbers do you think do have a home to go back to?
I think that there's a lot of people who are hoping that their homes are still standing, but even more people who know that their homes are not. I've actually been talking to friends and colleagues in Gaza since the ceasefire was announced last night. And it's one of the things that continues to be repeated by people, that they're happy, they're relieved that this might occur, but they have nowhere to go. They have no home to return to. And so I think Yes, we're going to see population movement as people try and go back to their communities or try and see what still stands and remains. But for a lot of people, they are now without a home. And that's going to be a really important part of the humanitarian response. I think we're talking potentially about hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, we're also talking about tens of billions of dollars to reconstruct Gaza after all of this. I mean, what sort of a bill could we be looking at here, and where's the money going to come from?
I think the international community obviously really needs to step up. This is something that UNICEF is not shying away from. We're going to be here every step of the way, meeting those basic needs at the outset, like I explained, but then staying with the children of Gaza every step of the way to help them rebuild. For example, more than 85% of schools are damaged or destroyed. 85%. So if we want to get children back into a classroom, we need to start rebuilding. So initially, we're going to be having temporary learning spaces where children can go to learn, but then we need to start looking at schools. We need to start looking at how we get those classrooms back up and running again. And that's going to require an enormous amount of time and energy and resources and money. I can't put a dollar figure on it just yet, but it's going to be a big job, and hopefully the international community will be behind it.
Yeah, we've just heard that the EU is going to be giving 120 million euros in aid for Gaza, and as you say, other powers might follow suit. But just to sort of sum up, really, what are going to be UNICEF's top priorities in the immediate term now?
So right away, what we want to do is bring in nutrition supplies to treat malnourished children. We want to bring in vaccines to make sure that children are immunised against the diseases that continue to threaten them, and medicines to help treat children who've got illnesses. We also want to bring in items for the temporary learning that I was speaking about. There's so many other components, blankets, clothes, the items and infrastructure to help repair those broken water systems. There's a lot that's got to happen, but look, we're really focused on those immediate basic needs of children in the early days, and then from there, those longer term rehabilitation and rebuilding efforts, should the ceasefire hold, which is our hope.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Tess Ingram, spokesperson for UNICEF. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Now, the outgoing US President Joe Biden last night delivered his farewell speech from the Oval Office. While drawing a line under a political career that spanned half a century, President Biden reflected on his 4 years in office, highlighting job creation and leading the United States as it emerged from the pandemic as being some of the highlights. He also said that the full impact of his administration would be seen and felt later on, saying that the seeds had been planted. However, he also warned of what he said were some of the dangers that lie ahead for the United States. Well, let's bring into the conversation Mo Vela, former Chief of Staff to President Biden, who joins us now from Miami. Mo, great to have you with us here once again on Al Arabiya News. I'd just like to start by picking up on what we've been talking about earlier in the programme, which is the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. It seems like there's a bit of a tug of war as to who deserves the credit for having achieved that. Would you say this is a credit to the outgoing administration or the incoming administration?
You know, it's absolutely a credit to the outgoing administration. They've been working on this ceasefire deal for months, as we all know. Everybody in the world knows that. But here's what I think is important right now. I don't think it's a time to be going back and forth and politicizing such an incredible milestone and monumental moment for peace. And you know what? My understanding is that one of Mr. Trump's representatives was present and involved in some of these last negotiations as part with the Biden team. And you know what? I think we rise above politics right now and give them both credit if that is due. But to try to say that the Biden administration shouldn't get credit is ridiculous. And I just think it's a waste of time and petty. They deserve credit. Anybody else who helped, if that includes Mr. Trump's team, they deserve credit. But the most important thing, Tom, is let's focus on the good that's going to come from that for the Israeli people and for the Palestinian people.
Thanks. And obviously the thrust of last night's 15-minute address was to really reflect on 4 years in office and also a 50-year-long political career. Some analysts, though, saying that 15-minute address was was a little bit dark in places. Do you agree with that?
You know, I think that I think it reflected, Tom, to be honest with you, the serious and honest and sincere concerns of President Biden. I just think he was being honest and real and transparent with what his fears and concerns are for our democracy and for our nation. But I think 50 plus years he dedicated to our nation. So our nation, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or a Libertarian, you're white, yellow, pink, green, or white, brown. It doesn't matter what any red state, blue state, Tom, doesn't matter. We owe this man an incredible debt of gratitude. So does other people around the world. He dedicated his entire life to our nation and to democracy and to peace. And so I didn't think it was dark. I thought it was simply realistic from his perspective. But overall, I thought it was his normal, kind and gracious and decent self.
I mean, he did warn, didn't he, of a dangerous oligarchy, he called it, being formed under the next administration, told Americans to stand guard. I'm not sure what you read into what Americans are supposed to do. But he talked about this oligarchy and its extreme wealth, power and influence, which he says threatens democracy, basic rights and freedoms. I mean, it sounded like he was basically taking aim at Elon Musk.
Well, it's extremely possible that he might have been referencing Mr. Musk, but there are other very wealthy people involved, as we all know. But look, I don't necessarily agree with the president on that. I still am at a place now, Tom, where I think I'm just sitting back and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. This new administration, I want to see what they plan to do and what they're able to accomplish. If in fact it's positive and it furthers our democracy, in fact, if they do create a situation here in the United States that improves the lives of all Americans, not just some, that's going to be the key question to watch. If they continue to improve our relations with other countries around the world, there will be a lot of things we're all going to be watching for. So I'm hopeful, but cautious is a good word. We've heard a lot of bluster the last couple of years, if not the last 6 or 7 or 8 years, for that matter, coming from Mr. Trump. But I'm hoping it was just that, Tom, and I hope he gets down to business and just really does focus on making our lives a little better here in the United States.
Looking back at President Biden's 4 years in office, he said that some of the benefits of his time in office will take some time to see or feel. He said the seeds are planted. I mean, not very clear. I mean, it's a little bit on the vague side there. But what would you say just were the concrete achievements of these last 4 years?
Well, I'll give you a real-life personal example. When I was the chief financial officer and senior advisor to Vice President Al Gore, when I was the director of management and senior advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden is what I meant. We had the American Recovery Act, as you might recall. And that was actually headquartered in Vice President Biden's office. I watched him and that team work on that. We are still feeling the impact and effects of that American Recovery Act in the way that those monies and funds were appropriated around the United States in all kinds of projects, Tom. And that's what he's referencing from his infrastructure bill, for example, and legislation. Those funds will be invested all over America, and sometimes you won't see the fruits of that labor for years to come, whether it's a bridge because they take years to build, or a highway, or all kinds of infrastructure projects, improving airports, ports. And so these projects, as you know, from an engineering perspective, can take a long time. They're very costly. So that's what he was referencing. We'll see the impact, the positive impact of his work for many years to come.
Okay, so what we've been looking at some of the things President Biden did do. One of the things he didn't do was to step out of the 2024 race in time to give another candidate a better shot at winning the election. And David Axelrod, I don't know if you know him, a former advisor to President Barack Obama, said, quote,
I do.
What he said is all Joe Biden wanted to be remembered for was the great things he did for this country. But at least in the short run, they've been eclipsed by his ill-conceived decision to run. And by that, he means to run again in the 2020 election. How damaging do you think that decision was by President Biden to his legacy?
I thought among our peers, among some circles, but I agree with that assessment. I have been saying that for a long time. I thought that he should not have run for a second term. And to be honest with you, as I always am, I actually fault his senior advisors in that case, because I think that they did a disservice by encouraging him to run, Tom, and trying to convince him that the numbers looked good and that he, had a better chance than I think all the data was showing. And I thought it was unrealistic. And so I actually fault them as well. And I think history will always reflect that was an erroneous decision. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I know the Bidens well enough to say that I don't think it was an egotistical decision. I think he really, truly, in his heart, believes to this day that he was the only one that could continue to save our democracy, as he did in the first time he won. And I think that was where he was coming from, Tom. But again, I also fault his advisors and his political advisors as well. And I thought it was a mistake. Yeah.
Just looking at you mentioned history, and I want to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit in just a moment. A CNN poll published yesterday gave President Biden a 36% approval rating, which is a bit better than Donald Trump's at 34% when he left office, much better than Richard Nixon's 24% when he left office, but still a long way off Bill Clinton's 66%, Barack Obama's 59%. Bottom line here is that President Biden is leaving office in the category of unpopular, I think it's fair to say, from that 36% approval rating. But do you believe that history will be kinder to him than an opinion poll that came out yesterday?
I do, actually. I saw that opinion poll. And again, I think we need to always keep in mind that there are a lot of people behind the scenes that probably deserve criticism much more than he does about those numbers. That I blame on, again, advisors, your communications team. I don't think they ever got their footing, Tom, from day one on messaging to the United States people and to the people around the world, for that matter, but more importantly here in America. They never really were able to effectively communicate the things he was accomplishing as we went along. So you never really saw his poll numbers ever improve. And that's a sign of a bad communication system, a bad messaging system, and not, just bad advice, frankly. So, but I do, in spite of that, I really do believe, as he was referencing, that his initiatives will impact and improve America over time. I think that that's where history will reflect kindly on him. I don't think we can overlook one very, very vital thing. This man is a decent man. This man is a gracious and kind man, a compassionate man. And I think that history will always reflect that decency. And I think that will always be kind of the prevailing theme that he will always be remembered for, is that he always was striving for bipartisanship, always. Some of the greatest lessons I learned in my own life were working for him, when he and I had very strong conversations and personal conversations about how important it was to always strive to work in a bipartisan manner. And he meant it and he lived it. And so I think history will be kind to him. I really do.
All right, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to reflect on the Biden legacy with us. Mo Vela, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tom.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.
Auckland. Auckland is known as a city of many lovers, according to its Maori name Tamaki Makura, as those lovers wanted the place so badly that they fought over it for centuries. A geographically blessed city, the New Zealand capital has the appeal of a small town and the style of a modern metropolis. Auckland Museum is one of the country's most recognized heritage locations. The 84-year-old museum houses the most comprehensive collection of Maori and Pacific Islander art in the Southern Hemisphere. On display are graphic textiles, carvings, some of the war canoes, ware or the traditional Maori meeting houses, as well as other 18th and 19th century portraits. Devonport is a self-contained late Victorian neighborhood of historic sites, including North Head, a British fort dating back to 1887. There are also popular cafes and restaurants within it. Find two of Auckland's picture-perfect beaches or climb to the top of Mount Victoria for 360-degree views of the city, Hauraki Gulf, and the North Shore. Waiheke Island is a place for a quick island escape. Worth visiting are the Little Onaroa, Palm Beach, and the mile-long Onatangi. Fancy a dinner nearby with a great view of the beach. A diverse mix of gustatory pleasures, Auckland is also ideal for food trips. The city is a medley of different tastes, offering diverse cuisines from contemporary Japanese dishes to all-American pizzas, to healthy Thai salads and greens. Depending on your mood, you can choose from the elegant dining restaurants, or you might prefer the laid-back alfresco cafes. Shopping also keeps the city abuzz. Specialty stores include rare and vintage finds, from the gardening books and electric furniture, Fiesta dinnerware and old photographs, as well as restored goods, such as vintage wooden cutting boards, Southern French crockery, and white enamel cookware. There are also classic and one-room boutiques that offer pieces for men and women, with a well-curated collection of shoes and boots to match. You may also find shops featuring own-brand clothes and jewelry for men and women, sold alongside a distinct merchandise mix of non-clothing items that reflect the owner's interests.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
But I do want to start off this conversation actually with Duncan. It's great to see you, sir. Thank you for joining us. We've been talking quite a bit about how the United States and the world is going to look going forward when we talk about the global AI boom. We're talking about a business that in just 1 year has gone from 50 billion to 200 billion, and there are real questions about how we are going to meet that demand. Duncan, when you look at the bigger picture, how worried should the world be at this point about mineral depletion?
Yeah, thanks. Look, it's great to be here, and this is an incredibly important topic for us all to be trying to get our heads around. I mean, there are a number of things that I think are manifesting themselves as a reality in the context of this transition today, which is, you know, it's not a demand problem, as you've pointed out. There are just so many drivers of demand for some of these very critical minerals like copper. What it really is a supply problem, and probably not so much an issue of the fact that there are no minerals in the ground. There are. But the time that it takes to bring these minerals into production is getting longer and longer and longer, and what it takes to bring them into production is becoming more and more and more complicated. So just, this is not really a matter of, what's happening in any one country. We almost need systemic solutions at a global scale to kind of make this work, because otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to deploy the capital, which is large in mining types of projects, at a pace and scale for them to happen. So you get this massive disconnect between short-term markets and the long-term drivers of markets. And you get this deep uncertainty, particularly with how the world is sort of geopolitically dividing itself up today, that's militating against the type and the patience of the investment that's needed to invest in these mines and bring these minerals out.
What does that mean for price?
Yeah, well, look, if I knew what price was going to be in the short run, I wouldn't have this job, that's for sure. It's very difficult, but there is this disconnect between the short-term prices and what we believe to be, the fundamental underpins to the long-term price. And it's that volatility that creates additional stress and pain, I think, in terms of investment in these sorts of projects to bring these minerals on.
Lorenzo, do you want to add on to that in terms of the price outlook for 2025?
Well, I think it's correct what Duncan said. It's very difficult to predict price. I think from a longer-term perspective, again, it's not a demand issue, it's a supply issue. And I know from a standpoint of the mining and mineral industry, it may seem strange to have Baker Hughes in the panel. However, we see a lot of similarities between what we've done in oil and gas and the industry and efficiency and driving optimization being an adjacency within the mining and minerals. There's a lot of technology that can be applied. And so the reason why we see it as an opportunity is because we can actually bring today the technology that's required at a lower cost point to make the industry more efficient and be able to supply what's required. And we see that from simple things like flexible pipes and composites. Being a large company in oil and gas, the skill set that we have there on large projects is easily transferable also to the mining sector. And working with companies like Anglo American or Vale or Rio Tinto, that aspect of technology collaboration is going to be key going forward. AI applications, we know there's a lot of subsurface information. At the end of the day, the minerals are like oil and gas. And so we have the technology and the know-how of being able to optimize that production by taking our subsurface knowledge, applying the data analytics. So price in the long term will solve itself from a market perspective. Our focus is, are we having it be affordable, sustainable, and also secure? That's imperative, just like energy. And so those are the similarities we see.
To your point, there are many similarities, parallels to the oil industry and to the oil markets. To that end, do you anticipate that we'll see a mineral supply crunch?
I think we're seeing events take place where in certain commodities at certain points in time there will be crunches. And to the point that was made, I don't think it's a shortage of the minerals. It's the ability to actually recover them in the time that's necessary at the price point that's competitive. And that's what we've got to solve for, just like if you go to mature wells in oil and gas. Today, there is plenty of oil and gas, and it's a question of optimizing what we have from a mature production perspective, making it more efficient. There's a lot of inefficiencies in the mining industry, as we've had in the oil and gas industry, that we can learn from together. Recovery rates, for example. How do you optimize the recovery rates from copper perspective? Or as you look at lithium brine, how do you optimize the recovery of lithium? And we know the soil and the subsurface is rich with this, and so we can apply those learnings. But there are going to be elements of dislocation in commodities at certain points in time.
No doubt. Steele, I want to ask you about the big headline in the Financial Times today, and of course, that is that the commodities super cycle in China is over. What does that mean for your business?
Whether it's over or not, I don't know, but finding a new engine, as I point out before, I think is the next challenge. We just need another driver for the economy, which translated to more consumption of the mineral. I think just go back to this topic of this capital deployment. And before that, I think maybe just touch on the depletion, because the way I look at this is two dimension of depletion. One is drop of the grid, and the other is the real depletion of the resources. And to deal with the drop of the grid, I think all the mining companies around the world have been doing this years and years, and very simple, because we need to add more throughput to the lower grade. And of course, the operation efficiency, as you point out, that we need to, for example, increase the recovery, because we need to extract more metals from the very limited resources. But really, to address those challenges, I think one key word I will think about going forward is the technology. A lot of people talking about this. But again, I think that there is different layer of technology when we talk about. One is not real high-tech stuff, but we have seen this before. This is, again, when you're adding more throughput, it will have the impact for the whole industrial chain. We see the bigger scale of the machinery, and the engineering related to that, and the equipment, all this kind of stuff. We see what's happening in the industrial chain to the mining industry, right? And also a lot of process stuff that we actually invested into this. This is not high tech, right? And the real new process and engineering alongside with this process is very important. And but on the other hand, the real high tech, I think we just need to be very open-minded to that. Because if you ask me, I'm not a geologist or mining expert, but if I look at the history of the mining, right, I mean, there's no real high tech in the last, I'll say, maybe 50 years. For example, the SXEW we're talking about in the copper industry, that's 40 years ago, something stuff, right? And the RKEF in the nickel industry is just, Duncan, maybe 15 years ago. Yep. But that really changed the structure of the industry. Yeah. But this is just the process. It's not high tech, right? But in the future, I believe there will be breakthrough technology to bring the real disruptive change to the industry.
Are those breakthrough technologies going to come as a result of AI?
Yeah, it could be, right? I mean, talking about the process, we just need some technology to help us memorize all the data and give the analysis and then eventually translate to the improvement of the efficiency. But this high-tech stuff, I mean, it's maybe not that suitable for our, old-fashioned schoolboys in the mining industry. But I believe there will be a lot of geniuses and, scientists that were working on that, and that will eventually come, I believe.
Graham, I want to bring you in on the conversation, and to my earlier question about the end of the super cycle in China. We also, of course, are just days away from the inauguration of U.S. President Donald Trump. Obviously, that raises a lot of geopolitical questions as well for critical minerals. Where does that leave, in your mind, Australia at this point, just in terms of the mining sector?
Yeah, it is an interesting one for Australia, because obviously one of their biggest customers and trade partners from the mineral side is absolutely China. You look at their iron ore exports and also their met coal exports. It's predominantly where they majority go.
You're kind of in the middle.
Yeah, it's sort of caught in the middle, but I mean, I think most of the companies now in Australia are more just an Australian company. So, for example, when we started our journey 10 years ago, we were probably 45% of our value was in Australia, 40% Southern Africa. In the next 18 months, we'll probably see more than 50% of the value in the Americas. So I think most companies have sort of been reorientating their portfolios based on the next wave of commodities. So to your point, I think maybe iron ore demand and met coal demand will be different in China, but I think globally the world's just starting to scratch the surface on demand for things like zinc and also copper. And I probably agree with all the points around existing operations, productivity improvements, but I think the industry is also massively underinvested over the last 15 years in exploration. And I think to Duncan's earlier point, absolutely agree. We're currently in the process of executing a project now in the US, and you used to talk about 0 to 9 years from find to have it operating. It's probably closer now to 0 to 15 to 20 years because of all the different stakeholders and permitting you got to go through. And I think that's going to create a crunch which makes commodity prices attractive.
Yeah. And when you think about that with regards to the price outlook, how difficult is it to get that longer term investment? Because we're talking about a price crunch and at the same point, the politics longer term.
So I had a session this morning, a round table, and we're talking about how do investors think about our sector. And I think the investor loves you to be safe, producing at a low cost, have a lot of growth options, but not be executing them. Because they don't want to give you value for those projects that you've got to execute because of the risk and the time it takes. So I think as you're a CEO on a board, you're caught in that position, you've got to balance the short, the medium and the long term.
Yeah. Is President Trump going to be good for price, do you think?
Look, I think there will be disruption and there will be change. What that'll be like, not sure what it looks like yet. I mean, generally, obviously, in the US, Republicans have been more pro-development, but then we've got our project Taylor, which is a lead, silver and zinc project in Arizona, in Fast 41, which has been a great permitting process for us in the US. Yeah. So I think under Democrats, we had a good experience, and we'll wait and see what happens with Trump.
Your Excellency, I want to ask you specifically about Egypt. You're anticipating that the mining sector will make up some 6% of GDP if all goes your way. The government is very much behind you in those plans. Bigger picture, though, where are you going to get the investment that's needed to get you there?
Very good. Thank you very much for the question. It's a great pleasure to be here. First of all, I'd like to really thank His Excellency Bandar al-Khourai for the invitation and for hosting this Future Minerals Forum, right, with such a global and esteemed gathering. When you look at Egypt's mining sector, today it constitutes maybe around 1%, right, of our GDP, and we really have an ambition to bring it to 6%. To be able to make that happen, we realize that we cannot do it in silo. So the first part is really in terms on how, as a new cabinet, we are really kind of all working together in terms on how we can make Egypt more investable in the mining sector to be able to attract, investment, not only for the short term, but really for a sustained long-term, timing frame. And for this requires a lot of collaboration that we've been working on with the different ministries, whether Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Environment, and all the various Ministry of Investment, all different, ministries. But above all, for us to succeed, really, we've decided that we have to put really our partners as our number one priority, and hence to really look in terms on what do we need to do in our regulatory, framework that would make really Egypt more investable, more attractive for investment into the mining sector. Because some of the regulatory framework which exists in Egypt, some of it was done a little bit more on the, the background of the oil and gas, which might not be typical in the mining sector to be able to attract global companies at scale to the sector. And this is why you really kind of worked in the spirit of partnership with global, companies such as with Barrick Gold, with the Sentiment, with Anglo Gold, in terms of looking, and with, different kind of companies to look at what would this exploitation agreement terms, would make Egypt really attractive for long-term investments, right, in gold, and potentially also other sectors. And we are very actually proud to be able to say and to announce that we have really worked very hard over the last, 6 months in terms of looking what this would look like. And as we speak this week, we are actually starting, in terms of the process of getting this through the parliamentary approval process to making sure that then we can leverage that. The second aspect is also how we can really look in terms on how we can inject different, type of investors in Egypt. To be able to achieve those goals, we need to have more exploration, and hence we need to have more juniors, being able to be in Egypt, and we have also to have more, major companies to be there, and hence on how we're looking in terms on how we're making licensing more effective, more available, and also simplifying, the process for approvals, environmental and plots and so forth, to be able to accelerate investment into the exploration and then into the exploitation. The other element which was also very important for us is how do we really make sure that we actually are able to market our investment opportunities. Egypt is very rich, in gold, is very rich, in terms of nickel, in terms of copper, some rare earth, minerals, phosphate, and diversity really in terms on minerals. However, how do we really work in a better way to be able to make the available what is, the opportunity that we have? And this is where the data is important. And this is where, again, I go back to where we're investing in terms of deploying actually a digital platform which would enable us to be able to articulate what today we do have in terms of Egypt, in terms of minerals, and hence be able to attract different investments into both exploration and exploitation, and as well into the value-added, derivatives for that. And maybe one more element I would really like to mention is really how we can really work together, right, with our partners in terms of also identifying what we have, and essentially, to know what we don't know. And if you look at the last, electromagnetic survey that has taken place in Egypt was probably around 1984, and hence really there is more investment that we are now focusing on to really be able to update really our minerals map and to be able to kind of invest more in terms of identifying our reserves. And this is where the point that, that also was mentioned by Lorenzo is also very important. I'm a firm believer on the role of technology. I believe today we're just scratching the surface in terms of what we know. And technology will play, a big role in this. And this is why we are really working with our partners to really be able to invest in Egypt. And also we are transforming our Mineral Resources Authority into an economic authority, which is also just going through Parliament actually this week, to be able to ensure that we actually have the tools to be able to invest into digital platforms, to be able to invest into surveys, and to be able to work with our partners to enhance the value of our subsurface resources.
The reforms that you've mentioned are crucial to the economic stability of Egypt, but it's also crucial to the political stability of Egypt. In your mind, how quickly are you going to be able to move toward those goals?
So actually, I'm pleasantly confident actually with that, because what I've seen could be done and could happen within the last 6 months, with a new cabinet in terms of really working together, with a common goal and the ability to really kind of have the engagement with our partners in terms of what is required for their success. And we're really using a motto is that the success of our partner is really our success. And I always say, help us, help you, help us, right? So it's kind of a collaborative spirit. And in all these different initiatives, it is not only one ministry which, is involved, and I believe this was mentioned in a couple of the earlier panels, working, with other ministries as partners with a common goal of what's in it for the country. And more importantly for our partners, because again, if the shareholders, are happy, companies can invest more, and then we can unlock the potential of the subsurface, not only for raw material, but also value-added, derivatives, for that to happen. So it's how we can all work with a collaborative and partnership spirit, that is the key.
Your Excellency, it's great to have you joining us on the panel. I want you to bring this sort of macro conversation a bit more micro. We've heard repeatedly from the Saudi government as part of Vision 2030 about just how important it is to secure those value chains and to invest. And you see that long-term investment and commitment from the country. How does this trickle down to your portfolio specifically?
Yes. Well, we're very lucky here in Saudi Arabia that we already have a very strong infrastructure to support the mining industry. Our roads, for example, is the most connected network globally. We've been investing in roads for many years. Our ports are state-of-the-art with the latest technology. We have a network of 5,500 rail lines, which were built largely to support the logistics industry and mining industry in particular. Last year alone, we've moved more than 25 million tons of cargo on our rail system, and most of that is minerals. Also, when we built our national transport and logistics strategy, it was built in full coordination with the Ministry of Industry and Mineral Resources to make sure that we are catering for the ambitious plans they have to build the mining industry. About 50% of our government funding in transport and logistics sector will be directed to rail. And that is largely to support industry and minerals. Our ports connectivity have doubled in the last 3 years. The number of national, international liner that are calling our port have grown from 53 to 115. Also, we are building our transport and logistics system while improving environmental friendliness, where we're using the state-of-art technologies. We're also making sure that in terms of operations, we also use the latest technologies to make sure that the operations are efficient and resilient. And resilience is very important, and it was tested during COVID. It was tested again currently during the Red Sea crisis, where about 50% of the trade in the Red Sea is affected by what is happening, while at the same time our imports and exports have grown by high single digits in last year.
Yeah. I want to bring it back to the question really that we were discussing at the top of the panel in terms of whether or not we'll find ourselves in a crunch, in a minerals crunch. When you think about this a little bit more, Duncan, how difficult is it to strategize when you have geopolitics at play on one track and then global demand on another? Because no doubt, whether you're sitting in Australia or whether you're in the United States, you get the risk of getting caught in the middle.
Yeah, you do. But look, I think this comes down to where you set the battery limits for your time frame in terms of trying to find a solution for it. Because it feels to me it's never been more urgent, from a global perspective, to come up with a system that can actually, what are very, very scarce minerals and metals to provide not only the energy transition. I mean, let's not forget that the vast majority of the improvement of livelihoods of humanity over time have been fundamentally underpinned and supported by metals and minerals, industrial minerals. So, in the long run, this may wash itself out in time if you think that you've got the time. If you think actually you don't have the time, then we really are in a crunch spot. Let's say that the energy transition is the driver of the timeline on this thing, because this is urgent in terms of dealing with the disastrous effects of climate change. And, all the climate scientists are indicating that this is in and around 2050, 2060 type of time. Well, then that's a different time frame with which you have to organize your optimal solution. And then, this real short-termism that we've been discussing is slightly problematic, because you don't actually get the input and the investment and the time that it takes to bring these minerals out. So you have to deal with this on multiple fronts. We've got to do exploration. I don't believe there's any one country, perhaps there are one or two in the world that are sort of more privileged than others in the context of the endowment that they have, but any one country on its own that has enough of the critical minerals, just for itself. I mean, we have to do this at a global scale. It has to be connected. We have to deal with it from an exploration point of view. We have to deal with it from an operations management point of view. We certainly have to deal with it from a technology and technology development point of view. And none of these things are instant. It does take time to develop technology. I mean, we can do lots of improvements around the fringes. This most operators will do over time, but Steele's point is very true, is that there hasn't been massive technological breakthroughs in this industry over time. We got to deal with technology. We've got to deal with infrastructure. So all the things that the excellencies were talking about are all very important and absolutely almost prerequisites. Good, strong fiscal policy, good, strong political stability are enablers, but then there's a whole sort of system connection that needs to be pulled together. If you're saying we're optimizing in a shorter time frame, and that shorter time frame is around about 20 years or so.
Yeah, Lorenzo, and I'll finish the session with you. Do you anticipate that that's achievable with the politics going into the next 4 years?
That's a challenging question, given what's happening in the next few weeks. I'm an optimist, and I think ultimately it is a global challenge that we've got to confront with all of the stakeholders convening and having the appropriate discussions. I look at it from the different areas. We play a role from a technology standpoint. Do I believe that the technology is there and that we can make significant progress and actually facilitate the efficiency, the optimization, the productivity? Yes, we've proven it time and time again. Do we know all the technologies today? No, but we've got a lot that is being worked on in laboratories. We've got a lot that's being scaled over time, and we've got a lot of lessons learned. As you look at the stakeholder of government, you need to have a pragmatic discussion on how we satisfy the needs of the growing population and also the demand for development and progression of people. And that's a need that everybody has a right to. And I think at the end, the investment that's required is going to be the scale of seeing the returns, but these are long-term investments. So next 4 years, I think, again, we'll see progress, we'll muddle through it, but it's the continuous progress that we've got to see around not even a transition, it's an expansion towards a lower carbon economy, utilizing the minerals, utilizing the mining, oil and gas, which is fundamental to what we have as goods in the marketplace today.
Gentlemen, Your Excellencies, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
New York, the Big Apple, the city that never sleeps. The most exciting in the world, New York, New York. Filled with restaurants, bars, museums, shopping destinations, and iconic sites, New York is indeed a welcoming city. A year-round destination with 4 seasons, New York is magical in the winter, with marvelous snowfalls and cloudless skies. In the spring and autumn, the city is at its best, with a crispness to the air and clear blue skies. The city is indeed filled with popular tourist spots. The most popular site is the Central Park, which transforms into a beautiful golden red in October. The Grand Central Terminal is known for its stunning historical feats. From its near destruction and restoration, the beauty of this famous Beaux Arts building is certainly a must-see. The Empire State Building, with its classic Art Deco architecture, is indeed a New York City icon. Its 102-story building is one of the most visited in the world. Visit the 86th floor outside observatory for views of up to 80 miles or 130 kilometers that are definitely worth the photos. The Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, the world's largest performing arts center, is also home to 12 resident arts organizations, including the New York Philharmonic, Metropolitan Opera, the New York City Opera, and the New York City Ballet. Not to be missed are the world-class museums, the American Museum of Natural History, the Museum of Modern Art, and of course, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Times Square is yet another tourist spot to visit. In the middle of the bustling hive of activity, Times Square is known for its huge electronic billboards and many destinations for fun and activities. And finally, the reason why New York is called the city that never sleeps. The place offers endless nightlife options to choose from that makes it almost impossible to have time for sleep. There are after-dark nightclubs, bars, theaters, live music, and comedy performances to explore every day, be it the weekend or a night after work. New York is also known as the restaurant capital of the world. With more than 18,000 eateries to choose from, just imagine how difficult deciding where to eat will be. The most expensive but worthy dining hangouts can be found in Midtown Manhattan, where reservations at restaurants are actually the standard.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs,